Smoke. Black against the gray Kansas dawn, not chimney smoke. Grass fire. A low orange seam crawls across the dry prairie. Slow. Hungry. Eating everything in its path toward the White House with the green door. Toward 70 head of cattle trapped against the creek. Two figures cut through the smoke. One drives a plow horse hard, tearing a raw brown firebrake 50 yards ahead of the flames. The other beats the leading edge with a wet grain sack, eyes streaming, lungs raw, hauling a panicked calf clear by the scruff. On the western ridge, two riders sit motionless, watching, not lifting a hand. The southwest wind still pushes. Sparks leap the brake. The fire finds a weak spot and begins to climb. One of the figures turns his horse, rides straight at the men on the ridge. No rifle raised. Only the quiet certainty of someone who has decided this ground will not burn. Kansas, early spring 1884. Naltsis had stopped counting the places that were not his. Not out of peace, out of exhaustion. Because a man can only count so many fences that belong to somebody else before the counting itself starts to feel like a wound he keeps opening on purpose. He was 30 years old, which didn't sound old, except it felt old. And in the particular way his shoulder ached where an army mule had thrown him 6 years back and never quite forgiven him for staying on his feet. Afterward, he'd scouted for the United States Army for 6 years, read ground the way other men read newspapers, told colonels where water was before the colonels believed water could exist in that stretch of nothing, found the pass through the rock that saved 2 days' ride, found the ambush before it sprung saved lives. More than once. Nobody wrote his name down when he did it. That was fine. Mostly. He told himself it was fine so many times the sentence had worn smooth, like a coin rubbed thin from too much handling, until it wasn't fine. Because the army decided his family belonged in San Carlos. Decided. He remembered the day the orders came down. Remembered it the way you remember a sound more than a sight, his mother's voice. Low, steady, telling him not to make trouble over it, because trouble was the one thing they couldn't afford. Not then, not with soldiers already forming a line at the edge of camp, like a fence made of men. He remembered nodding, remembered hating himself for nodding, remembered riding out on a scouting assignment 3 days later and coming back to find the camp empty. Cook fires cold, nothing left but wagon ruts heading south toward a place he had never seen, and at the time, had no permission to follow them to. He didn't talk about that, not to anyone. Not even to himself, most days, except in the hour right before sleep, when a man's guard goes soft whether he wants it to or not. He had a discharge paper somewhere, or he was supposed to have one. It got lost between a commanding officer's desk and a filing cabinet in a fort that smelled permanently of wet wool and old coffee, which meant, as far as any lawman in the territory was concerned, he did not officially exist as a free man at all. He existed as a rumor, a gap in a ledger. A man riding around without the one document that would make him safe to simply be. He told himself it didn't matter. Most nights he almost believed it. So he rode. From nothing toward nothing mostly. Because riding kept his hands busy, and his hands being busy kept his mind from doing the thing it liked to do in the quiet, which was replay the sound of his mother's voice the last time he heard it, low and steady, telling him not to make trouble. He did not let himself finish that thought. Not out here. Not in the open, where a man's face gives away everything the second he stops moving. He heard about Prairie Bend from a freight driver outside Dodge City, a heavy-set man named Purnell who talked with his hands and chewed the same piece of jerky for what felt like an hour. Cattle operation short of hands, Purnell said. Widow woman running it out past Harmony Way. Might be worth the ride, might be worth the ride. Naltsis had heard that sentence before, about 4 other towns. Every one of them had turned into the same conversation eventually. A man behind a counter looking at his face a half-second too long. A hand moving, slow, towards something under the counter that didn't need to be there at all. A door that used to be open, closing quiet, like it was closing on its own and nobody had touched it. You looking at me funny, Purnell said, not unkindly, wondering if I'm about to tell you something you don't want to hear. Are you? No. I'm telling you there's work. What you do with that. Wiped his mouth. Purnell spobbed to warn a grown man off a job. World'll do that plenty on its own. Fair enough, Naltsis thought. He'd take honesty over comfort, most days. Comfort had a way of turning out to be a lie wearing a friendlier coat. Still, he rode. 4 days out of Dodge City. Past grass that went on, it stopped looking like grass and started looking like water, moving in the wind the same slow patient way. Past a dead cottonwood split clean down the middle by some old lightning strike. Standing there anyway, half of it still green, like it hadn't gotten word that it was supposed to be finished. He thought about that tree more than he probably should have. Split down the middle. Still alive on one side. He didn't examine too closely why it stuck with him. And on the third day he crossed a ridge and saw smoke that wasn't smoke. Black timbers. A church, or what used to be one, burned down to its bones. The cross at the front somehow still standing. Blackened, tilted, stubborn. He didn't stop. He wanted to. Something in him wanted to get down off the horse and walk the ruin and ask it what happened, the way you'd ask a wound how it got there. But a man learns, after enough years, which questions are safe to ask out loud in a strange country and which ones are not. So he kept riding. He filed the church away in the same part of his mind where he kept everything else he wasn't ready to look at directly. That part of his mind was getting crowded. He was starting to notice. Follow the wagon road past the burned church, Purnell had said. Turn at the cottonwoods. Look for the White House with the green door. The cottonwoods were there. Tall, old, planted by somebody who expected to still be around to see them grow that tall. And past them up on a rise above a good creek the house. White green door, solid square. The kind of place that told you, just by looking at it, that somebody loved it, and was holding onto that love with both hands, refusing, plain and simple, to let it go. He sat his horse at the bottom of the rise longer than he meant to, because there was a version of this where he turned around right now, rode back the way he came, saved himself the exhausting business of hoping, and then being wrong about it. He had that version fully built in his head, clear as the road under his horse's feet. He could see himself doing it, could feel almost the relief of it, the relief of not finding out. Except he didn't take it, which was its own kind of answer, if he was being honest with himself. And he tried mostly to be honest with himself. It was one of the only luxuries he still had. He rode up, tied his horse at the gate, and before he even reached the porch steps, he took off his hat. Old habit, his mother's habit, really passed down and worn smooth like a stone in a creek bed. You take your hat off at another person's door. Doesn't matter who they are. Doesn't matter what they think of you before you open your mouth. You take the hat off first, and then you find out. He knocked, waited, told himself in the space of that waiting 3 or 4 different ways this could go. None of the versions he built were the one that actually happened. Verity Calloway had been in the middle of an argument with God when the knock came. Not a shouting argument. She didn't shout at God. Her mother had raised her better than that. And besides, shouting felt like admitting he might not already know exactly what she was going to say before she said it. It was a quieter argument, the kind conducted with a thumb pressed hard into the spine of a worn Bible, holding a page she'd read 4 times that morning without absorbing a single word of it. She had asked for a husband 2 months ago, on her knees right here in this kitchen with the ledger open on the table showing her exactly how many days she had left before the bank owned everything her husband Thomas had bled sweat into, and nothing had happened. No man had come. Just 60 days, ticking down to 58 to 55, while she prayed into a silence that was starting to feel less like patience and more like a closed door. So when the knock came, she was almost annoyed by it. Like God's timing had a sense of humor she wasn't currently in the mood for. She opened the door with the Bible still in one hand, thumb still marking her place, and stopped, because the man on her porch was Apache. Her mind did the thing minds do, fast, ugly, involuntary. A half second of every story she'd ever been told in this county, every warning. Every rumor passed hand to hand at the general store like a coin. Nobody wanted to be the one holding. A half second where her whole body went still the way it goes still before a storm decides which way it's turning. Then she looked at him, really looked. Head slightly bowed. Not submission manners, old manners, the kind that outlast the people who teach them. "Ma'am," he said, "I heard you might be needing a hand." She didn't answer right away, because there was a version of herself standing right behind her shoulder, a version raised on this county's fear instead of her own 2 eyes that would have said no thank you and shut the door. She could feel that version whispering it was the sensible thing, except sensible had not paid the note in 2 years, and safe had not fixed the fence line, or the well, or the roof going soft on the north side of the barn. Safe had left her sitting alone at this table every night doing arithmetic that never once came out in her favor. So she looked at him a moment longer, and she said the truest thing she had. "I've been praying for you," she said, "for 2 months." His whole prepared speech seemed to leave him at once. She watched it happen, watched something in his face go from careful and guarded to something closer to stunned. "Ma'am, not you, specifically. I mean, I didn't know it would be you. I only knew I needed a husband. And I've been asking. And you're the first man who's knocked on this door with his hat off before I even opened it." He was quiet. "You're not going to laugh," she said. "Not a question. An observation, the kind you make about weather." "No, ma'am." The last one did. She stepped back from the door. "Come in, I'll explain. You look like a man who rode a long way to hear it." His name, she learned, was Ruthless. He offered it plainly, without apology, watching her face, when he said it the way a man watches a door to see if it's about to close on him. It didn't. "Ruthless." She repeated it, careful, wanting to say it right the first time so she wouldn't have to ask again. "Some folks call me Ezra," he said, "when it's easier." "Easier for you? Or for them?" He looked at her a second too long before answering that one. "For them." "Then I'll call you Ruthless," she said. "I'd rather things be easier for the person actually doing the work." Something shifted in his shoulders. Small. She almost missed it. But she'd spent 14 months alone, reading every small shift in every person who walked onto this land, because a woman alone learns fast which small shifts matter and which don't. This one mattered. She sat him down at the kitchen table, put the ledger between them, open to the page of careful, patient figures she'd been keeping since Thomas died. 240 acres, she said. 70 head of cattle. A milk cow. 2 horses. The best creek within 10 miles. And a debt of $380 to the Prairie Bend Cattlemen's Bank. Comes due in 58 days. He looked at the numbers a long moment, not the polite, glancing look of a man being shown something he doesn't understand. The real look. The look of a man doing arithmetic in his head and not liking where it landed. "Bank won't extend it," he said. "Not a question either. Mr. Bellamy already told me. Gentle as you please. A woman alone, a risk they can't carry." She turned a page. "There's a man named Amos Draycott who owns the range to the west of me. Offered to buy this place twice. Both times I said no. Both times he smiled like a man who only has to wait. And the note requires a husband's signature. A husband's signature is the one the law will honor." She looked up at him. "I've done the arithmetic every way there is. Selling cattle leaves me nothing to winter on. Fighting Draycott and the bank in court leaves me poorer and still landless. There's one door left. I've stood in front of it for 2 weeks, asking God whether I was a fool for even considering it. And here you are," she said. "So I suppose I have my answer." She folded her hands over the ledger. "I need a husband more than I need a hired hand. So before I ever put word out that this ranch was hiring, I got down on my knees and asked God to send me one, a working man and honest. Somebody who'd knock instead of push. Silence, the kind with weight to it. You don't know me," he said finally. "No. But I know 3 things. You took your hat off before you reached my door. You told me you're a hard worker before I asked for proof of it. And when I told you I'd been praying for you, you didn't laugh. That's 3 things you know," he said. "Not much to build a marriage on. It's more than most marriages start with," she said. "Most start with a dance and a nice coat. I'll take a hat in a man's hands over a nice coat any day." He almost smiled at that. She caught the edge of it before he put it away. "That's more than I can say," she went on. "For the last man who sat where you're sitting, there had been another man, 2 weeks earlier. A drifter named Coy Pruitt, big through the shoulders, quick with a smile that didn't reach anywhere past his teeth. He'd listened to the terms, nodded along. Made all the right sounds a woman wants to hear when she's laying her whole future out on a table for a stranger to look at. Then he'd heard the word marriage, and something behind his eyes had shifted, quick and calculating, the way a man's eyes shift when he starts doing a different kind of arithmetic than the one you're doing. "Now about that creek," he'd said. "Seems like a lot of land for one man to hold on to for a woman who ain't blood kin. Maybe we talk terms on the deed itself before the ceremony. Get things square." "The creek rights aren't a term," Verity had told him. "They're the whole reason I'm sitting here. Just being practical is all." "So am I," she'd said. "The road's that way, Mr. Pruitt." He'd left within the hour, grumbling about ungrateful widows loud enough for her to hear through the door. She told Naltsus the short version of it now. "He heard the terms," she said, and heard the word marriage, and tried to talk me out of the creek rights before the ceremony was even planned." She almost smiled. "I sent him down the road. Some prayers get answered by a no, Naltsus." Naltsus turned that over. "And How do you know I am? I don't, she said, plain as anything. Not yet. I know you're a possibility. That's different from a certainty. I've had enough certainties turn out wrong in my life to trust the difference. He nodded slowly. Filed that away too, the honesty of it, the lack of dressing it up. She got up, crossed to the stove, poured 2 cups of coffee, black, and set one down in front of him without asking if he wanted it, because in her experience a man who's ridden 4 days wants coffee, whether he says so or not. Here are the terms, she said, sitting back down. You'd have a home, a real one, $40 a month once the note's refinanced, a share in the operation and a say in how it's run. In return, I need your name on the bank papers and your honest work on this land, every day, in front of God, whether it's easy or whether it isn't. He looked at the coffee, then at her. You're proposing a business arrangement, he said. I'm proposing a marriage that starts as one, she said. The rest is up to us and up to the Lord. She held his eyes. 2 are better than 1, the book says, because if either of them falls down, one can lift the other up. She paused. Let the next part come slower, quieter. I've been the one who falls down alone, Nalsis. I buried my husband. I've run this place by myself for 14 months, and I am telling you plainly, I am tired of falling with no hand to reach for. He was quiet a long moment. She let him be quiet. She had learned in 14 months of solitude the value of not filling every silence just because it made her nervous. There's something you should know before you decide anything, he said finally. About me, her stomach went tight. Here it comes, she thought. The thing that closes the door. I don't have my discharge papers, he said, from the army. They exist somewhere. Maybe. Or they don't, and nobody's told me which. Officially, as far as any lawman's concerned, I might as well not have a legal name at all. He met her eyes. Didn't look away from what he was saying, which she's noticed, and respected, even before she'd decided what to do with the information itself. If I sign your bank papers as your husband, and somebody decides to ask hard questions about who I am and where I came from, I don't have a clean answer for them. I could bring trouble onto this land instead of saving it. She sat with that. Because it would have been easy right then to be afraid. She could feel the shape of that fear sitting in her chest, ready to be picked up if she wanted it. She didn't want it. Mr. Draycott is already trouble, she said. The bank's already trouble. I've been living inside trouble for 14 months, and I've learned it doesn't much care whether I invite more of it in or not. It comes regardless. She held his gaze steady. I'd rather face it with an honest man beside me than a dishonest one, whatever paper he's carrying or not carrying. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked, if she had to name it, like a man being handed weight he wasn't sure his hands could hold, and finding out, right there, in that moment, that they could. You have until morning to decide, she said, standing, picking her Bible back up off the table. The bunk in the barn is clean. There's stew on the stove and bread in the box. She started toward the hallway, then stopped, turned back. Ask God what he thinks, she said. I find he's more useful in these matters than I am. He slept in the barn. It was a good barn. Dry. Tight. The animals settled and calm in a way that told him, without anybody needing to say it, that this was not a neglected place. A neglected barn shows in its animals first. This one didn't. He ate the stew standing up out of habit because sitting still to eat had never quite stopped feeling like a small luxury he hadn't earned. Then he lay on his back on the bunk and looked up at the rafters, and for the first time in longer than he wanted to count, he prayed for himself. Not for work. He'd stopped asking for that specifically a long time ago, because work always found him eventually, one way or another, whether he asked or not. He asked whether a man who had spent 30 years belonging to no one was permitted, this late, to belong to something. He didn't get an answer in words, but out past the east pasture, through a gap at the barn boards, he saw a rider sitting motionless on the ridge in the moonlight, watching the White House with the green door. Not moving, just watching the way a man watches something he intends to have eventually. Nalsis watched him back. The old instincts came up fast, the scouting instincts, the ones that never fully went to sleep even when the rest of him did. Count the distance. Read the horse, note the angle of the shoulders, whether the man was armed, whether he was alone. The rider turned, rode west. Before Nalsis could make out his face, he filed it away. Same place he filed the burned church. That part of his mind was getting crowded, and he was starting to suspect it was going to get more crowded before this was finished. Then he closed his eyes, and he slept better than he had in years, which, when he thought about it later, was its own kind of strange, given everything he now had reason to worry about. Except it wasn't strange, not really, because he'd spent 30 years sleeping in places that weren't his, always half listening, and for the sound of somebody telling him to move along. This was the first night in a long while where nobody owned the ground under him, but the woman who'd asked him plainly to stay. He came to the kitchen at 5:30. Verity was already up. Coffee made, biscuits in the pan, the Bible open beside the ledger the way another woman might keep a knife beside a whetstone. Side by side. Ready. She looked up when he came in, he said. She went still for a moment. Not relief exactly. Something slower than relief. The careful breath of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing alone and just felt a second pair of hands take the other end of it. Then sit down and eat, she said. We'll ride into town this afternoon, he sat. Naltsas. He looked up. Thank you. And thank him too. He did most of the work. I don't know about that, he said. Seems to me you did quite a bit of it yourself. 14 months of it from what you've told me. Maybe, she said. But I didn't do the part where a stranger rides 4 days and takes his hat off before I've even opened the door. That part wasn't mine to do. He didn't have an answer for that. So he ate his biscuit instead, and she let him. And the kitchen was quiet in the particular way a kitchen gets quiet when two people are both thinking the same thought, and neither one is ready to say it yet. They were married at 3 o'clock on a Thursday in the small clapboard church that had gone up to replace the one that burned. The storekeeper's wife and the blacksmith stood witness. There were maybe 9 other people scattered through the pews, and Verity noted, without letting it show on her face, exactly how many of them were there out of support, and how many were there out of curiosity about what a widow marrying an Apache man might actually look like up close. She counted more of the second kind than the first. She decided, standing there in her good gray dress, that she did not particularly care. The Reverend read from the 4th chapter of Ecclesiastes. When he reached the last line, Verity's eyes lifted, just slightly, toward Naltsus. Though one may be overpowered, the Reverend read, 2 can defend themselves, and a cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. 3 strands, Naltsus thought. Not 2, the man, the woman, and the one who braids them together. The ceremony took 12 minutes. Walking back to the wagon, Verity said, Thank you. Naltsus said, I'd like to go over the cattle records tonight, and I want to walk the creek fence before the week is out. I need to know what we're working with. She looked at him sideways. Most men, she said, say something else on their wedding day. Most men haven't seen your ledger, he said. That's not a compliment. Wasn't meant as one or the other, he said. Meant as the truth. I need to know what we're working with, so I can protect it properly. That's not a small thing to me. She considered that. And for the first time since he'd knocked on her door, the beginning of a smile crossed her face. It didn't fully arrive, but it was there. She'd take it. What she didn't see, because she was looking at her new husband, was Amos Draycott standing outside the land office, watching their wagon pass, with the stillness of a man who has just learned something he did not want to know, and is already deciding what to do about it. Naltsus saw him, kept his eyes on the road, but he saw him the same way he'd seen the rider on the ridge the night before, and he understood it is with the flat certainty of a man who has spent years reading danger before it announces itself, that those were the same man. He had mended enough broken things in his life to recognize a certain kind of trouble, the kind that starts with a man watching from a distance and saying nothing at all. Draycott didn't move, didn't call out a greeting, the way most men in a small town do when a wedding party passes. Whether they mean it or not, he simply watched, chewing something at the corner of his jaw, calculating. Behind Naltsus, from the wagon bed, one of the mourning doves that nested near the church took off suddenly, wings loud in the quiet street, and Verity flinched at the sound of it before caught herself. Just a bird, Naltsus said. I know, she said. Didn't feel like just a bird. He didn't tell her what he'd been thinking. Not yet. There would be a right time for that conversation, and a wedding day wagon ride through a town full of watching eyes was not it. Before they left town, Naltsus stopped at the forge. He hadn't planned to. Or maybe he had some quiet part of him had, the part that noticed the sign hanging over the door, Bragg's Ironworks, and felt something tighten in his chest before his mind caught up with why. The man at the anvil was heavier than he used to be, grayer at the temples. But the set of his shoulders, the particular way he held a hammer like it was an extension of his own arm, hadn't changed at all. "Sergeant Bragg," Naltsis said. Silas Bragg looked up, squinted into the afternoon light, went very, very still. "Well," he said, after a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "I'll be damned." "Might be," Naltsis said. "Wouldn't be the first time somebody told me that." Bragg set down his hammer, wiped his hands on his apron, slow, like he needed the motion to give himself a second to think. "Heard there was a stranger married the Calloway widow this afternoon," he said. "Didn't think for 1 second it'd be you." "Didn't think I'd be here either," Naltsis said. "Life's got a strange sense of direction." Bragg looked past him, toward Verity, who was waiting by the wagon, watching this exchange with open curiosity. "You two know each other," she said. "Not a question." "Served together," Bragg said, 6 years. "This man kept me and about 40 other soldiers are alive on more than one occasion I don't much like remembering in detail." "He never mentioned that," Verity said. "He wouldn't," Bragg said. "Never was one to talk about it. Had to hear it secondhand from men he pulled out of trouble, and even then he'd change the subject soon as you tried to thank him proper." Naltsis shifted, uncomfortable. "Wasn't anything but the job. Wasn't anything but the job," Bragg repeated, shaking his head at Verity like she should note the pattern too. "Man rides through an ambush twice to drag Corporal Halsey out by his collar, and calls it the job. That's the kind of man you married, ma'am. Whether he'll ever tell you so himself is a different question." Verity looked at her husband. Something new in her eyes now. Not suspicion. Something closer to recalculation, the look of a woman, adding a column of figures she hadn't known existed an hour ago. "Where'd you land?" Bragg asked. "Quieter now, after they sent your folks to San Carlos." Something crossed Naltsis's face. "Fast. Nowhere, mostly," he said, "until yesterday." Bragg nodded slowly. "Didn't push." That was the thing about Bragg that Naltsis remembered now. Coming back to him whole, the man knew exactly when a subject needed leaving alone, and exactly when it didn't. He'd learned the difference the hard way, probably, same as everybody who'd survived 6 years of army life learns most things. "You need anything," Bragg said. "Anything at all. You know where the forge is." "I'll remember that," Naltsis said, and he meant it in a way that went deeper than simple gratitude. Because in a county where he had exactly one man who knew his history and could vouch for it, that man being 5 minutes' ride from Verity's front gate felt less like luck and more like something closer to Providence. He didn't say that out loud, but he thought it, riding back to the ranch beside his new wife, the sun going gold and low over the grass. He thought about the burned church, the rider on the ridge who turned out to be Draycott, the forge with Bragg's name over the door, pieces on a board he hadn't finished reading yet. Elsewhere in Prairie Bend, in an office that smelled of tobacco and old paper, a man named Whitcomb was reading a telegram for the second time. Federal Indian Agent. That was the title on his letterhead, and he wore it the way some men wear a badge, like it excused him from ever having to explain his reasoning to anyone below his rank, which in his mind was everyone. The telegram concerned an Apache man, formerly attached as a scout to the 6th Cavalry, whose current whereabouts were unknown, and whose reservation status at San Carlos had never been properly closed out. A gap in paperwork. The kind of gap that, handled correctly, could become either nothing at all, or a very tidy little problem for somebody to solve and get credit for solving. Whitcomb had built a career out of solving tidy little problems. He read the telegram a third time. Not because it had changed, because he liked the shape of it, liked how a man's entire life could be reduced on paper to a single missing signature. He folded it, set it in his coat pocket, walked out into the street where the town of Prairie Bend was going about its ordinary evening business, entirely unaware that somewhere in its midst was the exact loose thread this telegram was asking him to find. He stopped a man on the boardwalk, asked, casual as whether anyone new had come through town lately. "Widow Calloway got married this afternoon," the man said. "Stranger. Big fellow. Apache, they're saying." Whitcomb's expression didn't change. It rarely did. But something behind his eyes sharpened, the way a hunting dog's ears come up at a sound, too faint for anyone else in the room to notice. "Is that so?" he said. He thanked the man, walked on, already composing in the careful bureaucratic part of his mind the letter he'd send by morning. 30 days, he decided. That felt like a fair number, fair sounding anyway, enough to look reasonable on paper. Not enough for a man to build a real defense. And somewhere behind him, unseen, Amos Draycott stood in the doorway of the land office, watching the agent walk the length of the street, filing away the sight of him the same careful way he filed away everything else that might, someday, prove useful. Two men in one small town, both circling the same piece of land from opposite directions, both patient enough to wait for the right moment, neither one aware yet that the other was circling too. That night, back at the ranch, Verity sat across the kitchen table from her husband of 6 hours and watched him read Thomas's old cattle ledger by lamplight, his lips moving faintly over the columns of figures, the way a man reads when he wants to be certain, not just informed. "You don't read easy," she observed, not unkindly. "Letters give me trouble," he said, not looking up. "Numbers don't. Numbers hold still. Letters like to shift around on a man when he's tired." She almost laughed, caught herself, because there was something in the plain honesty of it that's struck her harder than a joke would have this man on his wedding night, telling her the truth about his own limits without a flicker of shame in it. Thomas had never once admitted a weakness to her. Not one. Not in 6 years of marriage. He'd have died had died in a way before he'd have said a sentence like that one out loud. She filed that thought away. It wasn't the night for it. But she noted it, the way she'd learned to note everything now, because a woman who has run a ranch alone for 14 months learns that the small true things people show you, unasked, are worth more than every polished thing they tell you on purpose. Naltsis turned a page. Stopped. "There's a note here," he said. "In last March." She leaned forward. Draycott asking about the creek line again. Naltsis read slowly. "Land office says old survey may be off. Ride to Fort Hays and check the plat before dry season. Don't forget." Silence. "He never went," Verity said quietly. "The dry season came, then the storm, then—" She didn't finish it. Didn't need to. Naltsis closed the ledger carefully, like it was something that might bruise if he wasn't gentle with it. "I'll go," he said. "To Fort Hays soon as I can." She looked at him a long moment across the lamplight. "You just married me 8 hours ago," she said, "and you're already carrying my dead husband's unfinished business like it's yours to finish." "It is mine now," he said simply. "Isn't that what today was?" She didn't have an answer for that. Or she had one, but it sat too close to her heart to say out loud on the first night, so she let it stay unsaid and reached instead for the coffee pot and poured them both another cup, because some conversations are better carried forward in small quiet gestures than in words that might ask for more than either of them was ready to give yet. "Draycott stood outside the land office today," she said, after a while. "I saw him. You didn't say anything." "Wasn't the moment for it," Naltsis said. "There'll be a moment. This wasn't it." She studied him. "You do that a lot. Decide what's the moment and what isn't. Man doesn't survive as a scout by talking every thought he has the second he has it," he said. "Learn to hold things until they're ready to be useful. Otherwise you spend all your words on nothing and have none left when it matters." "That's a lonely way to live," she said quietly. It was, he agreed, until yesterday. She didn't answer that either. But something in her chest went warm and careful at once, the way a hand goes when it's holding something it's afraid of dropping. And beyond the edges of what either of them could see that night, a federal agent folding a telegram into his coat pocket, a banker doing arithmetic that didn't favor them, a neighbor watching from a doorway with the patience of a man who has already decided how this ends Prairie Bend, was quietly arranging itself into the shape of everything that was coming. Neither of them knew any of that yet. They only knew a ledger that needed finishing, a creek that needed protecting, and a marriage, still less than a day old, that had already started carrying more weight than either of them had said aloud. The days that followed had a shape to them, a rhythm. Verity noticed it before she could name it, the way a house starts to sound different once there are two sets of footsteps in it instead of one. Naltsis rose before the sun and worked past it. The fences, the creek line, the barn roof going soft on the north side, which he climbed up on the second morning with a mouthful of nails and came down 4 hours later, having replaced 11 boards. Thomas had been meaning to get to for over a year. He asked questions the way a man asks when he's trying to understand a thing, not impress the person explaining it, which was harder than it sounded. Because trying to impress somebody is easy, you just nod along and pretend you already know half of what they're telling you. Understanding takes longer, takes more humility than most men have room for. Verity answered with the plain efficiency of a woman who had explained this land to herself every single day for over a year, just to keep from drowning in it. And somewhere in the answering, she noticed something else. He remembered everything. She'd mentioned a thing once, that the low pasture flooded in a hard rain, that the milk cow kicked if you came at her from the wrong side, and he wouldn't ask again. He'd just work around it, like the knowledge had gone straight into his hands instead of his ears. You don't forget much, she said on the third morning, watching him approach the milk cow from exactly the right side, without being told twice. Can't afford to, he said. Man forgets the wrong thing at the wrong time out on a scouting trail. Somebody dies. Habit sticks with you even when the reason for it doesn't apply anymore. Does it feel strange, she asked, using those habits on a milk cow instead of a battlefield? He considered that. Actually considered it, the way he considered most things before he answered, not performing thoughtfulness, just genuinely working through it. No, he said finally. Feels like the first time the habits are being used for something worth keeping instead of something worth surviving. She didn't have a response for that. So she just handed him the pail and let the silence do the rest of the talking. He had worked for other men his whole life, and the work had always felt borrowed. Someone else's made straight. Someone else's calf pulled through a hard berth. Someone else's profit at the end of the season, and a wage in his pocket, and the road again. But when he climbed onto the north roof and drove the first nail into a board that was his to fix his, by law now and by bond vow, he stopped for a moment on the shingles and listened to the strike of the hammer come back off the barn wall. And it sounded different. He couldn't have told you how. It just did. He remembered a verse his mother used to say before the years took her and set him on the road. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. He'd spent 30 years laboring on houses that were never his. Drove the third. Maybe this one, he thought. Maybe this one you're building with me. On the fourth day, Bertie walked out to the small rise behind the house, where Thomas was buried, the way she did most weeks, though she hadn't told Naltsis that's where she was going. She just said she needed some air, and he'd nodded, shooshed, and let her have it. She drank, which she appreciated more than she said. The grave marker was simple, a slab of limestone with his name cut into it by the same blacksmith who'd stood witness at her second wedding 4 days ago, which struck her, standing there, your dues, as a strange enough thing to almost make her laugh. Almost. I don't know what to tell you, she said out loud, to the stone, in the way she always did. I married again. You'd have opinions about that, I expect. The wind moved through the grass. Nothing answered. Nothing ever did, but she talked anyway, because the talking was for her, not for him. But not anymore. He's a good man, Thomas. Different from you in every way I can name. You'd have liked arguing with him, I think. You always did, like a man who'd push back instead of just agreeing to keep the peace. She sat down in the grass beside the marker, pulled her knees up, let herself, for just a few minutes, be exactly as tired and as uncertain as she actually was, instead of the steady, capable woman she had to be for everyone else, every other hour of every other day. I'm not doing this to replace you, she said quieter. Now, I want you to know that. I'm doing it because I couldn't hold this place up by myself anymore, and because he took his hat off at the door, and because she stopped. Because the next part was harder to say than the rest of it. Some mornings, lately, I catch myself not being afraid, and I'd forgotten what that felt like. She sat there a while longer. Then she got up, brushed the grass from her skirt, and walked back down toward the house, where smoke was already rising from the chimney, and somebody was singing, low and off-key, in a language she didn't recognize, but found, somehow, she didn't mind not recognizing. Naltsus heard her coming before he saw her. He always did. Some old scouting habit that hadn't unlearned at itself and probably never would, and he stopped singing when she came through the door. Looked almost embarrassed by it. Wasn't much of a song, he said. Old thing. My mother used to sing it. What's it about? He considered it a moment. About a house, he said finally. Built right, so the wind can't take it. Sung it enough times as a boy, I don't hardly think about the words anymore. Just comes out. She sat down across from him at the table, where he was mending a bridle, his big hands surprisingly careful with the small leather work. Where were you, she asked, when you heard your family had been sent to San Carlos? His hands stilled on the bridle, not stopped exactly. Stilled. You don't have to answer that, she added quickly. No, he said. It's a fair question. I was out on assignment. 3 days. Came back to an empty camp. Cold fires. He kept his eyes on the leather in his hands, not on her. Took me another 11 days to find out where they'd taken them. By the time I got permission to go see them, it had been 6 weeks. Did you go? He said. Stood at a fence. Talked to my mother through it for 20 minutes before an officer told me I had to move along. That was the last time I saw her standing up, and well, Verity didn't say anything for a long moment. Because there was nothing to say to a thing like that. Nothing that wouldn't sound small next to the size of it. I'm sorry, she said finally. Simple, honest. No dressing it up. I know, he said. Most folks say something bigger than that. Something that's supposed to fix it. You didn't try to fix it, I noticed. Can't fix a thing like that, she said. Learned that myself, the hard way, 14 months ago. He looked up at her then, and something passed between them, not quite understanding, not yet, but the beginning of it, the first thread of a rope neither of them had started weaving on purpose. Grief doesn't care much whether it's a husband or a mother, she said. It just moves in and rearranges the furniture and dares you to complain about it. Despite himself, he almost laughed. That's about the size of it. First honest laugh I've gotten out of you, she observed. Don't get used to it, he said. But there was no edge in it. Just the dry, careful humor of a man who wasn't sure yet how much of himself he was allowed to bring to a table that wasn't his a week ago. Word of the marriage moved through Prairie Bend the way water moves through a dry creek bed after the first rain fast, and into every low place it could find. At the general store, a woman named Opal Finch, who had witnessed roughly half the weddings and most of the scandals in the county over the last 20 years, held court at the counter with a bolt of blue calico she had no particular intention of buying. Married a stranger she'd known one single day, Opal said, to whoever happened to be standing near enough to hear it, which was most of the store by the time she'd said it twice. An Apache man, if you can believe it. Read scripture, they say. Works like two men put together. Whole arrangement is either an answered prayer or it's a coming disaster, and I have not yet decided which. Maybe it's neither, said the young man behind the counter, whose name was Dell and who had learned, in 3 years of working there, that agreeing with Opal Finch was almost always the fastest way to end a conversation. Everything in this county is either an answered prayer or a coming disaster, Dell, Opal said. That's just how Kansas works. Across the street, in the shade of the land office awning, Ishmael Draycott listened to enough of that conversation drift through the open store door to know exactly how the town was leaning on the matter without needing to step inside and ask. He had already decided, 3 days ago, standing outside that same land office, watching a wedding wagon roll past, that this marriage was a problem to be solved rather than a fact to be accepted. The particular shape of the solution hadn't come to him yet, but he was a patient man. He had waited 14 months for a widow to grow tired of holding on to land she couldn't afford. He could wait a little longer for the right opening. He thought not for the first time about his wife. 4 years gone now. He didn't let himself think about her. Often it didn't do a man any good. Dwelling on a thing he couldn't change, but standing there in the shade, watching the town churn with gossip about somebody else's new marriage, something in his chest went tight and old and unwelcome. He put the thought away, went back to arithmetic instead. Arithmetic didn't ache the way memory did. Whitcomb composed his letter that same evening at a desk in the small room he rented above the land office, by the light of a single lamp turned low to save the oil. He was, by his own private accounting, a careful man. Not cruel. He'd have told you. If you'd asked him, though nobody ever did. Because nobody who worked for the Indian Bureau in 1884 was in the habit of asking a federal agent to justify himself to the people whose lives his letters rearranged. Careful. That was the word he preferred. He followed the regulations. He filled out the forms correctly. If the regulations happened to end in a man losing his home, his wife, his standing in a town he just started to build a life in, well, that wasn't cruelty. That was simply the shape the law had, and Whitcomb had never much seen the use in arguing with a shape that wasn't his to change. He wrote 3 drafts before he was satisfied with the tone. Formal, unhurried, the kind of letter that sounded on the page almost reasonable. Notice is hereby given, he wrote, that the individual known as Naltsis, formerly attached as scout to the 6th United States Cavalry, is required to report his current status and reservation affiliation, said status, having lapsed without formal closure. He read it back to himself satisfied. He folded it, sealed it, and set it aside to be sent by the morning post, not to the directly. Not yet. He decided he'd deliver this one in person. There was something useful he had learned over the years in watching a man's face when he received this particular kind of news. It told you things a written reply never could. Told you how much fight was in him. Told you exactly how hard the job was going to be. He blew out the lamp. Went to bed satisfied with a day's work well done, in the particular untroubled way of a man who has never once had to live inside the consequences of the letters he writes. Back at the ranch, the lamp in the kitchen burned a while longer. Naltsis had finished the bridle. Verity had closed the ledger for the night. The figures finally, for the first time in 14 months, tilting somewhere close to hopeful instead of desperate. I keep waiting, she said, for this to feel like it isn't real. Like I'll wake up and the note will still be due in 54 days, and there won't be anybody else's boots by the door. It's real, he said. How do you know? Because if it wasn't, he said, you wouldn't still be worried about it not being real. A dream doesn't make a person nervous about staying. Only a true thing does that. She looked at him a long moment across the lamplight. Something in her chest, unguarded for once, plain on her face before she could think to hide it. That's a strange kind of comfort. It's the only kind I've got, he said. Never was much good at the other kind. I think, she said slowly, I might be getting used to it anyway. On the 6th day, Naltsis rode the full length of the creek fence alone, from the north corner, where it met Draycott's range, down to the deep pool that never ran dry, even in August. He wanted to see it with his own eyes before he trusted anybody else's account of it, including the ledger, including Verity, including the note in Thomas's careful, worried handwriting that he still hadn't been able to put down for good, because a man learns, scouting 6 years for an army that's mostly didn't deserve him, not to trust a map until he's walked the ground it claims to describe. The fence was old in places, sound in others. Somebody had strung new wire along one stretch sometime in the last year. Tight, careful work, the kind Thomas must have done himself before the spring storm took him. Naltsis ran his hand along it and thought, not for the first time, about the strange arithmetic of stepping into a dead man's unfinished labor. Every fence post here was a sentence Thomas hadn't gotten to finish. Every one Naltsis drove now was, in its own quiet way, an answer to that unfinished sentence. He found the old survey stake near the north corner, half sunk in the grass, weathered gray. He crouched beside it. Read the faded marking on its face, the numbers worn but not gone, and something in him went still, because the stake sat wrong. He couldn't have told you right then exactly how he knew the same way. He couldn't always tell you how he knew a trail was watched before he ever saw the men watching it. It was a feeling built from 10,000 small observations stacked one on top of the other until they formed a certainty a man couldn't fully explain. Only trust. The stake sat wrong, which meant the line it marked sat wrong, which meant somewhere, on some old document filed away in an office he hadn't visited yet, there was a mistake, or something that wanted to look like a mistake, which was not always the same thing. He stood, looked west, toward Draycott's range, toward the ridge where he'd seen the rider that first night. Whoever had set this stake, he thought, hadn't set it wrong by accident. He rode home slower than he'd ridden out, turning the thought over the whole way, the way he used to turn over a strange set of tracks, before he reported them to a colonel who might or might not believe him. Some men, he'd learned, only believed danger once it had already arrived. He preferred to believe it a little early. Cost him nothing but caution. Cost other men, sometimes, everything, when they waited. Done. That evening at the table he told Verity what he'd found. Not all of it. Enough. The corner stake by Draycott's line, he said. It's off. I can't prove how much yet, not without a proper survey, but it's off. She set down her fork. Off which direction? West to east, he said. Which would mean the line's been drawn narrower than it should be, she finished. In Draycott's favor. That's my read on it, he said. Could be wrong. You don't sound like a man who thinks he's wrong. I don't, he admitted. But I've been wrong before. Learn to say so out loud when it happens, so folks don't start trusting me past what I've earned. She sat with that a moment, working something through behind her eyes. Thomas's note, she said. The one about riding to Fort Hays to check the plat. Same thing, Naltsis said. He saw it, too, or suspected it. Never got the chance to prove it either way, so we do what he didn't, she said. Not a question. A decision. Forming in real time, the way he was starting to recognize her decisions formed. Quick, once the facts were in front of her. Careful, before that. I'll write to Fort Hays this week, he said. Request a proper survey. A man named Whitfield used to do that kind of work out of there, if he's still around. Good with the transit and chains. Honest, from what I remember hearing. From the army? Everybody knew Whitfield, Naltsis said. Man surveyed half this territory at one point or another. If anybody can tell us the truth about that corner stake, it's him. She nodded slowly. Then something crossed her face, worry, arriving late, the way it sometimes does after the practical planning is already underway. If you're right, she said, and the line's been moved in Dracott's favor, that's not carelessness. That's theft, slow theft, done a stake at a time over years. Maybe, Naltsis said. A man who'd do that, she said, isn't a man who's going to take kindly to being caught at it. No, Naltsis agreed. He isn't. Neither of them said anything else about it that night. But something had shifted at the table, quiet and permanent. The way weather shifts before a storm arrives, the air itself changing, before a single cloud is visible on the horizon. Late that same week, a man rode up to the gate that neither of them had seen before, dressed in a dark, well-kept coat entirely wrong for ranch work, sitting his horse with the stiff, deliberate posture of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry. Naltsis was mending a hinge on the barn door when he saw him coming. Something in his chest went tight and familiar, an old feeling from years of watching officers arrive at a camp, with orders nobody wanted to hear. Afternoon, the man said, reining in at a polite distance. I'm looking for the man of this house. Understand there was a wedding here last week. You've found him, Naltsis said. He set down the hammer, didn't offer his hand. Something about the man's face told him a handshake wouldn't be welcome, and he'd rather not offer one that got refused. Agent Whitcomb, the man said. Indian Bureau. He said it plainly, the way another man might say his name was Smith, as though the title itself explained and excused everything that would follow it. I have some questions about your standing your discharge. Your current reservation status, if any. Verity had come out onto the porch by then, drawn by the sound of a stranger's voice, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes moving fast between the two men, reading the shape of the conversation before she'd heard enough of it to understand the words. He's my husband, she said, coming down the steps. Whatever standing he has, it's the same standing any married man in this county has. That may be your understanding, ma'am, Whitcomb said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. The law has a different one. I'm not here to argue it today. I'm here to inform you both that his file requires review. I'll be in touch formally in the coming weeks. Review, Naltsis said. Flat. A formality, Whitcomb said. Mostly. He touched the brim of his hat, the gesture so practiced and hollow it barely qualified as courtesy at all. Good day to you both. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. Unhurried, the same deliberate pace he'd arrived with, as though nothing about the visit had cost him anything at all. Which, Naltsis thought, watching him go, it probably hadn't. That was simply how cruelty worked in a man like that. Quiet, unhurried, costing him nothing. The paperwork that could take apart another man's whole life cost him nothing but the ink. Verity stood beside him, watching the rider shrink into the distance. What did he mean? She said quietly. By review. Means he's decided I'm a loose thread, Naltsis said. And men like that don't rest easy until every thread's tucked back where the pattern says it belongs. And if you don't fit the pattern. He didn't answer right away. Looked out at the land instead, the fence he'd mended, the roof he'd fixed, the creek that might or might not still be theirs once. A corrected survey came back from Fort Hayes. Then I suppose, he said finally, we'll find out together what a man does about that. She reached over, took his hand, didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. The taking of the hand said enough on its own, a promise made without a single word, the kind Verity Calloway had learned, over 14 hard months, mattered a great deal more than the kind made out loud. That night, Naltsis sat at the table long after Verity had gone to bed, a single sheet of paper in front of him, a stub of pencil in his hand, writing the letter to Fort Hayes one slow, deliberate word at a time. Letters gave him trouble. He'd told her that already, plain, no shame in it. But trouble wasn't the same as impossible. He'd learned enough, over the years, sitting beside campfires with soldiers who didn't mind teaching a scout his letters in exchange for him teaching them how to read a trail, that he could get the words down if he took his time and didn't let the shame rush him into mistakes. To the land office at Fort Hayes, he wrote, request survey of property boundary, Weaver no. He stopped, crossed it out, careful not wanting to waste the paper. Calloway land, he corrected. Formerly Calloway. Now, Stone, if a man could even properly claim that name yet, with a federal agent circling his file like a hawk over a rabbit hole, waiting to see which way the rabbit would run. He wrote Whitfield's name, if he's still there, and the date, and his own name at the bottom, not Ezra. He decided, sitting there in the lamplight, Naltsis. If the paperwork was going to determine whether he had a right to exist in this county at all, he'd rather it carry his true name than the easier one. Wally wrote. His mind drifted the way a tired mind does at the end of a long day, back to a ravine outside a fort whose name he'd rather not remember. 6 years gone now, but never fully buried. Gunfire. Dust thick enough to chew. A young corporal named Halsey pinned behind a rock with a shattered leg, screaming for a mother who was 2,000 miles away and couldn't hear him. Naltsis had gone in anyway, because that was the job. Because a man who could read the ground the way he could owed something to the men who couldn't. Bragg had covered him from the ridge, steady as a rock even with 3 men down already, and between the 2 of them they'd dragged Halsey out, through fire that should have killed at least one of them, and somehow, by whatever accounting the Lord keeps, hadn't. He never told anyone the details of that day, not because it shamed him, because talking about it made it feel like something he'd done for glory, and it hadn't been that. It had simply been the thing in front of him that needed doing, same as a fence needing mending, same as a letter needing writing, slow and careful, by a man who didn't waste words he didn't have to spend. He finished the letter. Read it back twice, checking each line, the way he'd check a trail for a second set of tracks he might have missed the first pass through. Satisfied, he folded it, set it by the door, ready for the morning ride into town. Then he sat a while longer in the quiet, listening to the house settle around him, a sound he still wasn't fully used to. A house settling, because it meant a house had weight to it, history, a right to exist that it was slowly, carefully passing on to him too. In the morning, over coffee, he told Verity what he'd written. She read it, careful, the same way he'd read her ledger that first night. And when she finished, she set it down and looked at him with something new in her face. You wrote this yourself, she said. All of it. Took most of the night with my name on it. I was going to send something with my name on it that somebody else. Not on this. It's a fine letter, she said. And then quieter, you didn't sign it Ezra. No, he said. Why not? He thought about how to answer that, honestly, the way he tried to answer most things she asked him. Because if Whitcomb's going to spend his career deciding whether I have a right to my own name, he said I'd rather he do it looking at the real one. Man ought to at least know exactly whose life he's tearing up if he's going to insist on tearing it up at all. She reached across the table, put her hand over his, the way she had at the gate a few days before, the gesture becoming, without either of them quite deciding it should, a kind of language between them that didn't need words to carry its full weight. Whatever comes of that letter, she said, and whatever comes of Whitcomb and Draycott, and every other man in this county who thinks he gets to say in whether we keep what's ours. I want you to hear me say this once, plainly, so there's no confusing it later. He waited. I didn't marry a business arrangement, she said. Not anymore. I don't know exactly when that stopped being true. Maybe the barn roof, maybe the letter you just wrote all night by lamplight because you wouldn't let somebody else carry a burden that was yours to carry. But it stopped being true somewhere in this last week, and I think you already know it too. He didn't say anything for a long moment. The old habit, hold a thing until it's ready to be useful, warred, for once, with something stronger. Something that wanted saying now, not later, not when it was convenient, not when the moment was perfectly chosen. I know it, he said finally, simple, true. Outside, the light was coming up gold over the east pasture, over the cottonwoods, over a fence line that might or might not still belong to them. Once the truth of that corner stake came back from Fort Hays. A federal agent was somewhere in town, composing his next careful letter. A neighbor was somewhere on his own land, doing arithmetic that still didn't favor them. Neither one of those men knew yet what had just been said, quietly, plainly, over 2 cups of coffee going cold in a kitchen that was finally, unmistakably, starting to become a home. But it had been said. And in a county where so much still hung in the balance, the note, the creek, the survey, the letter writing to Fort Hays, the review Whitcomb had promised, and not yet delivered, that one true thing, spoken out loud between 2 people who had known each other exactly 9 days, Felt like the first solid ground either of them had stood on in a very long time. Silas Bragg rode out to the ranch himself 2 days later, ostensibly to deliver a mended plow blade. Verity hadn't ordered yet, but would need soon enough that the excuse held together well enough for politeness. Really, Naltzis understood. The moment he saw him coming up the road, Bragg had come to look. To see with his own eyes how his old sergeant, his old scout, the man who dragged him, and half a cump more trouble than either of them cared to count, was actually settling into this new life. Folks in town couldn't stop talking about. "Heard Whitcomb paid you a visit," Bragg said, swinging down off his horse, not bothering with small talk first. That wasn't his way. Never had been. "Word travels fast in this county," Naltzis said. "Word travels fast in every county," Bragg said. "Man like Whitcomb, though, he don't visit quiet-like. Likes folks to know he's been by. Makes the review feel more official, I expect, if half the town's already whispering about it before the paperwork even arrives." "You know him?" "Know of him," Bragg said. "Every fort I ever served near had one like him eventually. Fellow who never fired a shot in his life, but figured out early that a signature can do more damage than a rifle and cost the signer a good deal less." Verity had come out to greet him, and Bragg tipped his hat to her with a warmth that hadn't been there in town, the stiff formality of the public street replaced by something easier, now that it was just the three of them and a plow blade nobody particularly needed yet. "I want you to know something, ma'am," Bragg said, "and I'll only say it once, because I'm not a man who repeats himself past what's necessary. Whatever paper Whitcomb thinks he's got on this man, whatever gap he's found in some fort's filing cabinet, it doesn't change what I know. I served 6 years next to him. I'd stand up in any courtroom in this territory and say so, under oath, without blinking." "Why are you telling me that?" Verity asked, and not him. "Because he wouldn't ask me to," Bragg said, glancing at Naltzis with something between fondness and exasperation. "Never would. Man'd rather carry the whole weight of a thing alone than trouble somebody else with a corner of it. Always was that way. Nearly got him killed more than once, that particular habit." Naltzis said nothing, but something in his jaw tightened the small involuntary tell of a man being seen a little too clearly by somebody who'd earned the right to see him that way. "I'm telling you," Bragg said, turning back to Verity, "so that when the day comes, and it will come, I'd bet the forge on it that you need somebody standing beside you in a room full of folks who don't know this man the way we do. You remember, there's a blacksmith 5 minutes down the road who already made up his mind about him a long time ago, and it isn't going to change on account of a federal agent's paperwork." Verity looked at him a long moment, then at her husband. "Thank you," she said, quiet and true. "I'll remember." Bragg nodded, satisfied, the way a man nods when he's said the thing he wrote out to say and doesn't see much use in dressing it up further. He handed over the plow blade, which Verity accepted with a faint, knowing smile, both of them understanding perfectly well it hadn't really been the reason for the visit. "You need anything," Bragg said, swinging back up onto his horse, echoing the words he'd said in town nearly 2 weeks before. "You know where the forge is." He rode off down the road the same unhurried way he'd arrived, and Naltzis stood watching him go, feeling something in his chest that he didn't have an easy word for. Not quite gratitude. Something larger than that. The particular, unfamiliar weight of discovering that the ground under a man's feet could hold more than one kind of solid thing at once: a marriage, a home, and now, it seemed, an old loyalty that had followed him all the way from a ravine, 6 years gone to a dirt road in Kansas, waiting patiently the whole time to be useful again. Outside, the wind kept moving through the cottonwoods, the same patient, endless motion it had been making since long before either of them was born, and would keep making long after both of them were gone, indifferent to banknotes, to burned churches, to federal letters, folded neat in a drawer waiting to be delivered, to a neighbor's old grief, turning slowly into something harder and more dangerous. None of that had announced itself yet, inside this kitchen, on this particular night, but it was already on the road, the way weather always is, long before you feel the first change in the wind. Kansas, summer, 1884. Whitfield arrived on a Tuesday, dust on his coat, a transit case strapped across his saddle, like it mattered more than anything else he owned, which, Naltzis understood inside the first 5 minutes of watching him work, it probably did. "Heard from a man I used to serve with," Whitfield said, climbing down, already scanning the horizon like the land itself owed him an explanation. "Said there was a corner stake worth a second look." There is, Naltsis said. You sure, or you hoping? Sure. Everybody's sure, Whitfield said, unstrapping the case. Half of them are wrong. Chains don't care which half you're in. Fair enough. You served, Whitfield said. Not a question. He'd have recognized the posture from a mile off, the stillness of a man who used to stand watches for a living. 6 years. Scout. Figures, Whitfield said. Man who scouts learns to trust his own eyes over everybody else's story. Same thing I do for a living, just with instruments instead of instinct. He hefted the case onto his shoulder. Let's go see what the ground's got to say for itself. Whitfield looked at him a beat longer, nodded once. That was all the conversation either man needed. 2 days. Chains dragged through grass, click by click, each length measured and written down in a small book with a stub of pencil. Same as Naltsis's own careful hand the night he wrote the letter that brought Whitfield here in the first place. Verity rode out on the second afternoon, sat her horse in the shade of the cottonwoods, watched. She didn't understand the instrument work, not really the transit's brass fittings, catching the sun, Whitfield calling numbers back to Naltsus, who wrote them down without needing to be told twice. But she understood the shape of what it meant. Understood that somewhere in that patient, boring, unglamorous business of chains and angles, the whole future of this ranch was quietly being decided. She said nothing for a long while, because there wasn't anything worth saying yet. Just numbers being taken. Just the slow, patient work of proving a thing true. Except patience wasn't the only thing riding on that creek that afternoon. Because across the line, on Draycott's side, a rider sat still on his own horse, watching the same way he'd watched the wedding wagon roll past. The same way he'd watched from the ridge that first night. Naltsis didn't wave, didn't nod, just noted him, filed him away. That part of his mind was still crowded, getting more so by the day. He's been out there since noon, Verity said quietly, not taking her eyes off the far rider. I know. Doesn't he have his own range to tend to? Man's tending to this range, Naltsis said. Just doing it from a distance is all. Watching's its own kind of work, if you're the sort who thinks land belongs to whoever's most patient about wanting it. And are you the patient sort, she asked, or the sort who rides straight at it? He glanced at her, the faintest edge of a smile at the corner of his mouth. Depends on the day, he said. He found Draycott 2 mornings later, not by accident. He'd ridden out looking, deliberate, because a man doesn't solve a problem by avoiding the person causing it. Draycott was mending his own fence line when Naltsis rode up. Didn't stop working. Didn't look up right away either. Come to accuse me of something, Draycott said. Come to ask you something. Same thing most days. Naltsis, dismounted, stood at a fair distance, close enough to talk, far enough not to threaten. The corner stake, he said. Somebody moved it. Years back, from the wear on it. You wouldn't know anything about that. Draycott finally looked up and smiled. The kind of smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. Old survey's been wrong longer than either of us has lived here, he said. Wrong ain't the same as moved. Didn't say moved, Naltsis said. Noted, said you wouldn't know anything about it. Notice you didn't answer that part. Silence, which told Naltsis everything the man's mouth hadn't. You've got a way of talking, Draycott said, for a man with no papers to his own name. Papers or not, Naltsis said, I know how to read ground. That's a skill no forts ever managed to lose the file on. Draycott's jaw tightened. You think that's clever? Wasn't trying to be clever, was trying to be plain. Whitfield's finishing his numbers this week, Naltsis went on. Whatever they say, they'll say it plain too. No arguing with a chain and a transit. Man might disagree with the fence line. Can't disagree with arithmetic. Everybody can disagree with arithmetic, Draycott said. Questions just how loud they're willing to do it. Is that a threat? It's weather, Draycott said. You'll know it when it arrives. Naltsis mounted back up, looked down at him a long moment. I've read worse weather than you, he said. Rode, through most of it too. He turned his horse. Rode off, didn't look back. Didn't need to, he could feel Draycott's eyes on him the whole way down the fence line. Same as a man feels a storm building at his back, before the first cloud ever crosses the sun. Bragg came to the ranch on a Thursday when Naltsis was out walking the far pasture, checking water gone since before light. Verity was hanging wash when she saw him ride up. Something in his face different from the last visit, slower, more careful. Naltsis is out, she said. I know, Bragg said. Came to see you this time. She set down the basket. Waited. There's something you ought to know, Bragg said. Been sitting on it since the wedding, trying to decide if it was mine to tell. Decided today it wasn't to keep it from you any longer. You're frightening me a little, Silas. Not meant to frighten you, he said. Meant to give you something true to hold on to, is all, given everything else that's circling this place lately. He took a breath. You said your husband Thomas was thrown breaking a fence line in a storm. That's right, before that, Bragg said. Years before. He rode escort on a supply convoy out past Fort Hays. Green as new grass. Wagon train got pinned down in a ravine by raiders nobody saw coming until it was near too late. Verity's hands had gone still at her sides. Because there was a version of this conversation she could already feel coming, some instinct in her chest arriving a half step ahead of the words, the way dread sometimes does. And she almost told him to stop. Almost said she wasn't ready. Except stopping him now would only mean carrying the not knowing a while longer, and she'd carried enough not knowing in this past year to last several lifetimes. Naltsis was scouting that convoy, Bragg said. Went back into that ravine twice. Once for the wagon master. Once for a young corporal wedged under a busted axle who couldn't have been more than 19 and was screaming loud enough to draw fire onto both of them. He held her eyes. That corporal was Thomas Calloway. The wash basket sat forgotten at her feet. For a moment she didn't say anything at all. Couldn't. Her mind was doing the thing it did sometimes. Late at night, when a memory of Thomas surfaced without warning, freezing, then rushing, then freezing again, unable to settle on anyone, feeling long enough to name it properly. He never told me, she said finally. Quiet. Wouldn't surprise me, Bragg said. Men who go through something like that don't always talk about it after. Especially not men who were as young and as scared as Thomas was that day, might not have even known the scout's full name. Might have buried the whole memory somewhere he didn't visit often. Does Naltsis know, she asked, that it was Thomas? Bragg shook his head slowly. I don't believe he does, he said. I only just put it together myself this past week, going back through what I remembered of that convoy. Wasn't certain enough to say anything until now. Man saved a lot of soldiers in 6 years, ma'am. Faces blur. Names blur worse. But the ravine, that one he'd remember if he thought hard enough on it, that one nearly took him too. Verity stood there a long moment. Something enormous moving through her chest, too large to name in one piece, grief and wonder, and something that felt almost like the ground shifting gently under a house that had already, this past month, started to feel steady. He came to my door, she said, half to herself. Except he wasn't, was he? Not really. He'd already saved this family once, long before he ever knocked. Seems that way, Bragg said gently. Do you think? She said slowly, working through it out loud, that it means anything. That out of every ranch in this county needing a hand, he ended up walking onto the one Thomas came home to. The one Thomas is buried on. I think, Bragg said, that a man who spent his life believing in coincidence usually stops believing in it around the 3rd or 4th time. The same coincidence saves his life. I stopped believing a long time ago, but that's just an old soldier's opinion. You're the one who prayed him here in the first place. Might be you already had your own answer to that question before I ever wrote out today. Something in her chest went warm at that, warm and unsteady, the quiet satisfaction of a private conviction finally confirmed by somebody else's outside eyes. Don't tell him, she said suddenly. Not yet. Let me find the right way to. Wasn't planning to, Bragg said. Place. Was only place to tell you. He tipped his hat. Figured you'd want to be the one holding that going into whatever's coming next. Man ought to know somebody's carrying a little extra faith in him even before he's earned the right to hear why. He rode off. Left her standing in the yard with a basket of forgotten wash and a truth so large. She wasn't sure yet where in her chest it would fit. She picked up a shirt, held without pinning it to the line. Stood there a long while staring at nothing until the wind finally reminded her the wash wasn't going to hang itself. The survey came back on a Monday. Whitfield rode out himself to deliver it. Corrected line. 40 rods further west than the old plat showed. The deep pool that never ran dry. Even in August, the water every dry season in this county eventually came down to sat. By honest measurement, unquestionably on Calloway land. Stone land now, theirs. Filed at the county seat that same afternoon. Beyond dispute, beyond argument, beyond whatever weather Draycott had promised was coming. Congratulations, Whitfield said, shaking Naltsis's hand. Not every man gets to prove himself right against a whole county's worth of assumptions. Wasn't about being right, Naltsis said. Was about the ground telling the truth. I just asked it to. Whitfield smiled at that. Rode off satisfied with a job honestly done. Verity stood beside her husband, reading the filed document twice, like she still didn't quite trust good news to hold still long enough to be real. "It's ours," she said. "It was already ours," Naltsis said. "Now it's ours on paper too. Paper's just catching up to the truth." She looked at him, thought about what Bragg had told her 4 days ago, still sitting unspoken in her chest like a coal banked on ash, waiting for the right moment to be shown. This wasn't the moment. She could feel that clearly. There would be a moment. This wasn't it. Except good news in Prairie Bend never seemed to travel alone, because 2 days after the survey filed, another rider came up the road. Dark coat, deliberate pace, the same unhurried arrival that had chilled Naltsis's chest the first time he'd seen it. Whitcomb. He didn't dismount this time. Sat his horse at a distance, the way a man sits when he wants the conversation to feel smaller than he is. "Your file's been reviewed," he said. "No greeting, no preamble.
Nah.
Discharge status confirmed as unresolved. Reservation affiliation confirmed as lapsed without proper closure." "Meaning what?" Naltsis said. "Meaning you're required to report to San Carlos," Whitcomb said, "within 30 days. Failure to do so constitutes unlawful absence, and I will be obligated to have you taken into custody and escorted there myself." Verity had come out onto the porch. Her face had gone the particular white of a person hearing the exact fear they'd been holding at arm's length finally arrive and say its own name out loud. "He has a home here," she said. "A wife, land filed and legal as of 2 days ago. None of which changes the regulation, ma'am," Whitcomb said. "Not cruel. Worse than cruel and different. I don't make the law. I only see that it's followed." "You could choose not to follow it so eagerly," she said. "There's a difference between duty and appetite, Mr. Whitcomb, and I think you know which one's driving you out to this ranch twice in a month." Something flickered across Whitcomb's face, the first real reaction she'd gotten out of him. Gone almost as fast as it arrived. "Careful, ma'am," he said. "Obstruction of a federal review is its own kind of trouble. Wouldn't want to add to what your husband's already carrying." "He's not carrying it," Naltsis said. "We are." Whitcomb looked at him a long moment. Something almost like curiosity behind the flat official mask. "You could run," he said. "Plenty. Do. Cross into the territories, disappear into a name nobody's looking for. I've seen it before. Might even work for a while." "I know," Naltsis said. "And yet you're standing here telling me you won't." "I've spent 30 years disappearing into names nobody was looking for," Naltsis said. "Isn't a life. It's just a longer way of dying quiet. I'd rather stand here and make you say the words to my face than spend one more year of my life being a rumor." Whitcomb studied him. For a moment, something almost like respect crossed behind his eyes, quickly buried, the way a careful man buries anything that might complicate a decision he's already made. 30 days, he said again. He touched his hat. "I'd advise against making this harder than it needs to be." He turned horse, rode off, unhurried, the same way he always rode off, like nothing about the visit had cost him a single thing. Naltsis stood watching him go until the dust settled, until the road was just a road again, empty, ordinary, betraying nothing of what had just been decided on it. Verity found Naltsis in the barn that evening, sitting on an overturned bucket, elbows on his knees, staring at nothing in particular. "You could run," she said quietly. "Tonight." "I know you would," he said. "That's not why I'm not doing it." "Then why?" He looked up at her. "Because I spent 30 years running," he said. "From towns that didn't want me. From an army that used me up and lost my papers like I was a supply requisition instead of a man. I'm done running from ground. That's mine. If Whitcomb wants to take me off it, he can come do it in the daylight, in front of the whole county, and answer for it. I won't make it easy by disappearing into the dark like I've got something to be ashamed of." "That's not caution," she said. "That's pride." "Might be both," he admitted. "Man's allowed both, I think, long as he knows which one's driving." She sat down beside him on a second bucket, didn't say anything else for a long while. Just sat close enough that their shoulders touched, which said more than either of their voices could have managed just then. "There's something I haven't told you," she said finally. "Been carrying it 4 days now, trying to find the right moment. I don't think there's a right moment left to wait for." He turned to look at her, waited. Except she found, sitting there in the barn dark, that the words wouldn't quite come the way she'd rehearsed them. Because how do you tell a man he already saved your life once, years before he knew your name, without it sounding like a debt instead of a gift? "Bragg came by," she said instead, choosing the easier door in first. "Told me something about a convoy, about a ravine near Fort Hays. Something shifted in Naltsus's face, old memory surfacing unwilling the way it always did when that particular ground got walked on. There were a lot of convoys, he said carefully, a lot of ravines. There was Corporal, she said, wedged under a wagon axle, screaming. He went very still. You went back for him twice, she said. Bragg says you don't remember faces well after all these years. Names blur worse, he said. They do, Naltsus said quietly. His name was Thomas Calloway, she said. The barn went silent, except for the shifting of a horse in its stall, the small ordinary sounds of an evening that had, without warning, tilted sideways into something neither of them had words ready for. Naltsus sat very still. Somewhere behind his eyes, she could see him reaching backward through 6 years of dust and gunfire, and names he'd never had the luxury of holding on to, trying to find the shape of one particular ravine among a dozen others that all, from a distance, looked the same. I don't remember him, he said finally. Honest, the way he was always honest, even when honesty cost him something. I wish I could tell you I did. Wish I could give you that. You don't have to remember him, she said. I think that's the part I keep circling back to. You didn't do it because you'd remember it later, or because anybody would thank you properly. You did it because it was the thing in front of you that needed doing, and because of that, because of a man you can't even picture now. I had 6 more years with my husband than I might have had otherwise, and that man's widow ended up praying 2 months ago for exactly the kind of husband who'd knock instead of push. She reached over, took his hand in the dark. I don't think that's coincidence, Naltsus, she said. I've stopped believing it could be. He didn't answer right away. Couldn't. Something too large was moving through him, the ache of discovering that a debt he never knew he was owed had somehow, all on its own, already been repaid to him tenfold, in a green door, opening, in a woman's steady gray eyes, in a home he hadn't believed himself allowed to ask for. 30 days, he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. 30 days, she agreed. We'll use every one of them. Draycott heard about the corrected survey the same afternoon it filed. Heard about Whitcomb's visit 2 days after that, from Bellamy, who heard it from a teller who'd heard it from half the town by then, because nothing in Prairie Bend stayed quiet for long. He sat in his own kitchen that night with a bottle he didn't usually let himself finish, and Bellamy across the table from him, nervous in the specific way of a banker who has already broken more rules than he's comfortable admitting. Surveys filed, Bellamy said. Legal. Can't be undone now, not without expose exactly how that old line got drawn wrong in the first place. And if that comes out, it won't come out, Draycott said. And the federal agent, Bellamy's right. 30 days, they're saying. Maybe the problem solves itself. Maybe he's just gone. Come autumn, and the widow's alone on that land again. Same as before. Easier to 30 days is too long. Draycott said, quiet. Final. I've waited 14 months already. I'm not waiting 30 more days on a federal clerk's schedule. Not when there's a chance that agent decides to be reasonable, or that man finds some lawyer willing to fight the ruling, or that fool woman finds 100 ways to buy him more time than 30 days. What are you saying? Draycott didn't answer directly, just looked out the window, toward the dark shape of the range that used to be entirely his, before a stranger with a hat in his hands rode in and started undoing, piece by careful piece, every quiet advantage Draycott had spent years building. You ever lose something, Draycott said, after a while, and spend years afterward telling yourself the losing was somebody else's fault. Bank's fault, weather's fault, anybody's fault, but the plain bad luck of it. Amos, I lost my wife 4 years ago, Draycott said, quieter than Bellamy had ever heard him. Fever, nothing anybody could have stopped. And I've spent every year since telling myself that if I just held on to enough ground, built up enough of something solid under my feet, it'd fill the hole where she used to be. He turned back from the window. It hasn't. Not once. But I don't know how to stop trying, Horace. That's the truth of it. I don't know any other way to be a man anymore except the one who's always reaching for one more acre. Bellamy sat with that a long moment, some of his fear softening briefly into something closer to pity. That doesn't make what you're about to do right, he said carefully. No, Draycott agreed. It doesn't, then don't do it. Draycott looked at him, and whatever softness had crossed his face a moment, before hardened back over, quick final, the way a wound closes when a man decides pain is easier to carry than change. Dry summer, he said. Grass hasn't had rain in 3 weeks. Wouldn't take much. Bellamy went very still. You're talking about fire. I'm talking about confusion, Draycott said. A boundary that's 2 days old on paper. A man the federal government's already decided doesn't fully belong here. Something burns in the night, out near his fence line, and by morning nobody in this county is going to be asking careful questions about whose match it was. They're going to be asking whether it's safe to have him still living out there at all. That's not confusion, Bellamy said low. That's a man's whole life, Amos. So's mine, Draycott said, and I intend to keep it. The wind came up hot and dry out of the southwest that Saturday night, exactly the kind of wind a man waits for if he's planning to light something he wants to spread fast and travel far. Naltsis smelled smoke before he saw it. Sunday morning barely light, and something in the air was wrong in a way his whole body recognized before his mind had finished waking up. Not wood smoke from a chimney. Grass smoke, wild, spreading. He was off the porch at a dead run before he'd even pulled his boots on properly. West, along the creek line, a low orange seam crawling through dry grass toward the near pasture, toward 70 head of cattle that had nowhere to run but into more of the same grass. No lightning that night. Clear sky at dawn, which meant it hadn't started on its own, which meant somebody had been out here in the dark, striking a match against ground he now called his, and walking away satisfied. Woke Verity with 2 words. Fire. Coming. She was up before he finished the sentence. You don't have to come, he said, saddling fast, hands moving on instinct while his mind raced ahead to wind speed, to fence lines, to which direction the cattle would panic toward. They're my cattle, she said, cinching her own saddle just as fast. And it's my creek, and I did not bury one husband and pray up another just to sit in this house and watch it all burn. She grabbed the wet sacks off the pump. He grabbed the plow horse. They rode into the smoke together. The fire moved faster than a man could walk, slower than a man could ride. That narrow margin was the only thing they had. Naltsis read the wind first old habit, the scout's habit, the one that never fully slept. Southwest, steady, pushing the flame line northeast toward the near pasture, which meant the break had to come ahead of it, not behind it, which meant there was exactly one place a plowed line would actually hold, and it wasn't the place most men would have guessed at. Panicked in the first gray light of a burning morning. There, he shouted, pointing. Cut it there. 50 yards ahead of the leading edge. Anywhere closer the wind jumps it before the dirt's even turned. Verity didn't argue, didn't ask him to explain the reasoning. Just drove the plow horse hard toward the spot he'd marked, tearing a raw brown line across the grass of firebreak, bare dirt the flames couldn't cross. Naltsis beat at the leading edge with a wet grain sack, choking, eyes streaming, driving the cattle east toward the water where the fire couldn't follow. His mind was doing what it had always done in danger reading, calculating, 3 steps ahead of his own hands. Wind direction, grass density, where the flames would want to go if left alone, and where a man could force them to go instead. Smoke rolled thick enough to swallow the sun. Somewhere behind him a calf bawled, panicked, separated from its mother in the chaos, and he went after it without thinking, hauling it bodily out of the smoke by the scruff, coughing so hard his ribs ached, half-blind, moving on memory and instinct because his eyes had stopped being any use to him at all, because this was the thing nobody told you about fire, he thought, dragging the calf clear. That it wasn't loud exactly, not the way you'd expect. It was a low, hungry roar underneath everything else, and underneath that, silence, the terrible silence of grass that used to hold larks and mice and every small living thing, gone quiet all at once, fleeing or already lost. He didn't let himself finish that thought either. Not now. Now there was only the next stretch of grass, the next panicked animal, the next 50 yards of line that had to hold, and out past the smoke on the ridge. 2 riders sat their horses, not neighbors coming to help, men waiting to see how much would burn. Naltsis rode straight at them. No rifle raised. No threat made beyond the simple fact of a man on a horse coming through smoke he knew, with total certainty now they had set. This ain't your fight, friend, one of them called. It's my land, Naltsis said. Filed 2 days ago at the county seat, clean and legal. You're welcome to ride to Fort Hays and check it yourselves if you doubt me. He held the man's eyes through the drifting smoke. I'm going to save my cattle now, he said. You can get down off that ridge and help, and I'll call it a neighbor lending a hand. Or you can ride back to whoever's paying you and tell them, the survey's filed, the creek is ours, and the next man who lays fire to my fence line is going to answer for it. To me and to the Almighty. And I promise you the Almighty is the more patient of the two. Silence. The wind gusted, fire crackled behind him. The second rider muttered something low. Both of them turned their horses and rode west, away from the fire, away from the ridge, away from whatever they'd been paid to watch happen. Naltsis turned back toward the smoke, toward the small figure of his wife driving a plow horse along the creek, jaw set, eyes red from smoke and something raw underneath it. The brake was holding barely, in places where the wind gusted hard enough to throw a spark clean across 4 feet of turned earth, but holding. He rode the length of it once more, checking, the way he'd checked a perimeter 100 times before in a different kind of danger. Found a weak spot where the flames had crept close enough to threaten catching on the far side. Beat it back with the last of the wet sack, his arms burning with exhaustion, his lungs raw. Then there was nothing left to do but wait and watch, and hope the line he'd chosen had been the right one. He got down off his horse at the fire break, looked up at that hard, clear dawn sky. "Lord," he said out loud, "the way you talk to somebody standing right beside you. We've done what we know how to do. Lines cut. Cattle's near the water. Can't make it rain. You know we can't, so if it's your will to save this place, you'll have to send the rest. I'm asking. She asked you for me, and you sent me. So I'm trusting you won't leave the job half done." The fire reached the plowed break, faltered, found no grass to cross into, threw sparks that strained toward the far side and found nothing there to catch. And the wind, the hot, dry southwest wind that had carried it all morning, shifted, came around, out of the north, cool, sudden, pushed the fire back onto its own burned ground, where there was nothing left to eat. Naltsis, standing black with soot at the edge of the plowed line, felt the first fat drop of rain strike the back of his hand, then another. Then the sky opened. It came down in gray sheets. The first rain in 3 weeks, hissing where it hit the coals, running in muddy rivulets down the plowed break, soaking both of them to the skin where they stood. Verity slid down off the plow horse, walked to him through the rain and the ruined, smoking grass. Her hands were shaking. She noticed now that there was nothing left to do but stand still and feel the size of what had almost happened. Neither of them said a word about the fire at first. Not yet. There'd be time for that. Right now there was only the rain and the smell of wet ash and the particular exhausted stillness that comes after a body has spent everything it had. She looked up at the sky, rain running down her face, and she was laughing, or crying, or both at once, the way a person is when a thing that could have taken everything has just, at the very last possible moment, decided not to. "I sought the Lord," she said, "and he heard me and delivered me from all my fears." Psalm 34, Naltsis said. She looked at him, surprised even through the exhaustion. "You've been reading it?" "Every night," he said. "After you go to sleep, trying to catch up to a God who's already ahead of me." She reached out, took his soot-black hand in her wet one, and they stood there in the rain, in the middle of the land they had just saved together, closer to each other than either of them had been to another human being in a very long time. "You knew exactly where to cut that line," she said, quiet, studying him now with something like wonder. 50 yards ahead. "I'd never have guessed right. Would have cut it too close, the way most folks do when they're panicking." "Wasn't guessing," he said. "Was reading. Wind, grass, ground, it all tells you where it wants to go, if you know how to listen instead of just react." "Where'd you learn to listen like that?" "Had to," he said simply. "Man who doesn't learn to listen to danger before it arrives doesn't usually live long enough to get good at anything else." She held his hand a moment longer, thinking of Bragg's words from days before, that a man could carry a whole ravine's worth of skill into a Kansas morning and use it, without ever once needing to be thanked properly for where it came from. "Thank you," she said. "For all of it. The line, the cattle, riding straight at those men instead of running from them." "Wasn't going to run," he said. "Told you that already. Not from this land. Not from anything standing on it, trying to take it." They walked back toward the house, together, leading their tired horses through the last of the rain, the smell of wet earth and burned grass, mixing into something that was, strangely, almost sweet, the smell of a disaster survived, of a thing tested and found, against every reasonable expectation to hold. That night, once the animals were settled and the worst of the soot scrubbed away, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in a single blanket against the cool air the storm had left behind, watching the last of the daylight drain out of a sky that had tried, that morning, to take everything from them. I was afraid, Verity admitted, quiet, into the dark. Out there, more afraid than I let myself show. I know, Naltza said. Saw it in your hands on the reins. You was, he said. Just learned a long time ago not to let it show in my hands. Fear in a scout's hands gets other men killed. Habit stuck same as most of them do. Doesn't that get tiring, she asked, carrying it all where nobody can see? He took a moment before answering, weighing the honest answers against the easy one. It did, he said finally. For 30 years it did. Tonight. Some. Not as much as it used to. Why not? Because tonight I wasn't carrying it alone, he said. First time in longer than I can rightly measure. She leaned her head against his shoulder, felt the steady, the deep, exhausted rhythm of his breathing, the smell of smoke still clinging to both of them, despite the scrubbing, the ache in every muscle from a morning that had asked more of them than most mornings ever would. Bragg's going to look through his trunks, she said. For your discharge, he is. And if he doesn't find it, then we'll find another road, Naltza said. Same as we found one for the survey. Same as we found one for the fire this morning. Man doesn't get to choose whether trouble comes, only gets to choose how hard he's willing to work at outlasting it. That's a tiring way to live too, she said softly. Maybe, he admitted, but it's a way that's gotten me this far, gotten me to this porch, this blanket, this particular woman leaning on this particular shoulder, on a night I half expected to end a good deal worse than it did. He turned his head slightly, looking down at her in the fading light. I'll take tired, if tired comes with this attached to it. She didn't answer with words, just tightened her hand around his, soot-stained and rope-burned and steady, and let the silence between them say the rest of it, the way silence had started to do more and more often, between the two of them these past weeks not empty, the way silence used to feel to her in the months after Thomas died, but full. Full the way a held hand is full the way a house is full, once it finally has two hearts beating inside it instead of one grieving alone. Word of the fire reached town before noon. At the general store, Opal Finch had a fresh audience and made the most of it, her voice carrying over the bolts of calico and the barrels of nails with the particular relish of a woman who has never once let a good story wait for confirmation before repeating it. Fire out at the stone place, she said. Whole West Range near went up. And here's the strange part, folks are saying it started awful close to where that new husband of hers sleeps. Awful close indeed. Could have been an accident, Dell said, from behind the counter, though with less conviction than he'd have liked. Could have been, Opal allowed. Dry summer, though. And a man with no proper papers to his name, and a federal agent already sniffing round asking questions. Folks do talk, Dell. Can't much stop them. Doesn't mean the talk is true. No, Opal agreed in the tone of a woman who found that distinction largely irrelevant, but it doesn't mean it's false either, does it? And in my experience, once a rumor's dressed and out the door, most folks don't much care to see its papers before they let it in. Across the street, Draycott listened to the shape of that conversation drifting out through the open door, same as he had 2 weeks before, and felt something cold and satisfied settle behind his ribs. The fire itself had failed. The land was still theirs, the survey still filed, the creek still running through Callaway ground, and not his own. But the story was doing exactly what he'd hoped it would do, all on its own, without him needing to lift another match. But rain doesn't undo everything, because 3 days later, a man rode out from town with news that landed harder than the fire had. Somebody nobody would say exactly who, though everybody had a guess, had gone to Whitcomb directly. Told him the fire on Callaway land had started suspiciously close to the barn where the new husband slept. Told him it looked, to a careful eye, less like an accident, and more like a man trying to burn away evidence of something. A boundary dispute settled too conveniently. A survey that had turned in his favor right before flames appeared on the very line in question. Whitcomb didn't need much encouragement to believe the worst of a file he'd already flagged as trouble. He sent word that his review was no longer just a matter of paperwork. Now there were questions about conduct, about character, about whether 30 days was even the right amount of patience to extend a man under this much suspicion. Naltza read the message twice, felt something cold settle behind his ribs that the fire itself hadn't managed to put there, because he had fought that fire with his own 2 hands, had ridden straight at the men who set it, had done everything right, everything honest, everything a man could do, and somehow, By morning, the story being carried through Prairie Bend wasn't about the fire he'd stopped. It was about the fire he was now being quietly accused of starting. "They're going to use it," he said to Verity that night, the paper still in his hand. "Not the survey, not the land. The fire. That's the thread they'll pull. Then we find who said it," she said. "We prove it. The same way you proved the survey." "Proving it against a fire," Naltsis said slowly, "is a different thing than proving a stake was moved 40 rods. Fire doesn't leave numbers behind, it leaves ash. And ash doesn't testify for anybody. Except he'd already gone looking. That morning, before the message from town had even reached them, before Whitcomb's suspicion had a name to attach itself to. He hadn't told her yet. Wasn't sure how to say it in a way that sounded like evidence, instead of a man grasping at anything solid to hold on to. He'd walked the burned ground at first light, alone, reading it the way he'd read 100 campsites before, where men had stood, how long, which direction they'd come from, and gone. Because a fire that starts on its own leaves one kind of story in the ash. A fire that's helped along leaves another. He'd found the place. Northwest corner, where the grass met the fence line closest to Draycott's range. Boot prints, pressed into the mud from the last rain before the dry spell, half burned over but not erased. 2 sets, standing still a long while from the depth of the prints, not walking through. And near them, one, half sunk in ash, the blackened stub of a matchbook cheap tin cover, the kind sold at exactly one place in the whole county. Bellamy's bank kept a dish of them by the teller window, free for any customer who wanted one. Draycott, Naltsis knew for a fact, banked nowhere else. It wasn't proof, not the kind a judge would accept without argument. A matchbook could have blown in from anywhere, a careful lawyer would say. Boot prints could belong to any man in the county with feet the same size, but it was something. A thread, thin as it was, that pointed the opposite direction from the one Whitcomb's informant wanted the story to run. He told Verity all of it now, laying it out plain the way she'd laid out her ledger for him that first afternoon. "It's not enough on its own," he said, "but it's a start, and starts are usually all a man gets, before the rest of the truth agrees to show up." "Bragg would know how a matchbook like that could be traced," she said. "Whether Bellamy keeps account of them, whether anybody else in town uses the same brand." "I'll ride to the forge tomorrow," Naltsis said. She sat with that a long moment, some new resolve hardening behind her eyes. "Then we find people who will," she said. "Bragg, Whitfield, anybody in this county who's watched you these past weeks with their own eyes instead of listening to whatever Opal Finch is repeating at the counter. That might not be enough," he said quietly. "Against a man who's already decided what he wants to believe." "Then it'll have to be," she said. "Because I am not sitting in this kitchen a second time in my life, doing arithmetic that comes out against me, without at least trying every column first." He rode to the forge the next morning, the burned matchbook wrapped carefully in a scrap of cloth in his coat pocket, like something too fragile to risk losing. Bragg turned it over in his blackened fingers, examining it the way he examined a piece of iron before deciding what it could be shaped into. "Tin cover," he said. "Bellamy's had these made up special, 2 summers back, free to customers, like you said. But he keeps a rough count. Near as I recall, orders a certain number each season, doesn't like giving away more than he's budgeted for." "Would he tell a federal agent that count?" Naltsis asked. "If it happened to point somewhere Bellamy himself didn't want it pointing." Bragg's mouth went thin. "Bellamy's not a brave man. Never has been. But he's not entirely a cruel one either, not underneath the fear of losing his position. Man like that, pushed hard enough, sometimes surprises you which way he breaks. That's not much to build a defense on." "No," Bragg agreed. "It isn't. Not yet." He set the matchbook down carefully on the anvil, like it deserved more respect than its size suggested. "But I'll tell you something else, while we're standing here, trading what thin threads we've got." Naltsis waited. "I've been thinking on your discharge," Bragg said. "The lost paper. Ever since Whitcomb showed his face in this county, truth be told, but more since he started talking 30 days, like it was nothing more than a delivery schedule." He wiped his hands slow on his apron. "I kept records back when I mustered out. Copies of things. Habit I picked up from a quartermaster who taught me that the Army loses paper the way a drunk man loses his hat regular and always at the worst possible moment. I've got trunks back at my place. Never had cause to go through all of it since." Something in Naltsis's chest went very still. "You think your copies might include—" "I don't know," Bragg said honestly. "Wouldn't want to hand you hope I can't back up with truth." But I served alongside you the same 6 years, and a man doesn't process paperwork on soldiers he never expects to see again, without occasionally holding on to more of it than strictly required. I'll look. Take me some time. Trunks haven't been opened in years, and my memory for where anything sits in them is worse than it ought to be for a man my age. I'd be grateful, Naltsis said. Simples. The words not nearly large enough for what he actually felt. Standing there in the smoke and heat of the forge, being handed, unasked, the first real thread of hope he'd had since Whitcomb's horse first came up the road. Don't thank me yet, Bragg said. Thank me if I find something. Till then, all you've got is an old blacksmith's memory and a burned matchbook. And neither one of those has ever won an argument with a federal agent on its own. It's more than I had yesterday, Naltsis said. That's usually how it goes, Bragg said, turning back to his anvil, the conversation closing, the way his conversations always closed, abrupt. Practical, no wasted ceremony on the way out. A man doesn't get the whole truth handed to him all at once. Gets it a thread at a time, and has to trust the weaving'll hold before he can see the whole cloth. Outside, the rain that had saved their cattle 3 days earlier had long since passed, leaving behind clear skies and a wind that had gone quiet, patient, waiting the way weather does between one storm and the next. Whitcomb's 30 days were still counting down. Fewer of them left now than either of them liked to think about. Draycott was still out there, still patient, still certain that a fire that hadn't finished the job the first time might yet finish it a different way, not with flame this time, but with suspicion, which burned slower and, in its own way, spread further. And somewhere in Verity's chest, still unspoken in full, sat the rest of the truth Bragg had given her, that the man standing beside her in this fight had, without either of them knowing it, already saved this family once before, years before he ever knocked on a green door, with his hat in his hands. That truth was going to matter. Soon. She could feel it, the way she'd learned to feel every important thing on this land now before it arrived, the way weather always announces itself if a person knows how to listen. Kansas. Autumn, 1884. Bragg found the paper on a Tuesday, not looking for it exactly. Or he was, except by then he'd stopped believing he actually would. Three trunks, 2 full evenings. Enough old army paper to choke a man on dust alone. Muster rolls and requisition slips and letters from soldiers who never made it home to read the replies. His hands ached from the sorting. His eyes burned from the lamplight, low to save the oil, same as always, and somewhere around midnight on the second evening, he'd nearly given up, nearly closed the last trunk and told himself he'd tried, which would have been true, and told himself that trying was enough, which would not have been. Except he didn't close it. Because something stubbornness maybe, or 6 years of habit that had never once let him leave a job half finished, kept his hands moving through one more layer of paper, one more folder, one more supply ledger nobody had opened in years, until his hand found something stiffer than the rest. A folded document, edges gone soft with age, tucked inside that ledger, like somebody had hidden it there on purpose. Or, more likely, like a tired clerk had simply filed it wrong in the last chaotic hour of a long war and never thought of it again. He read it twice before he let himself believe it, because there it was. Discharge, honorable, for services rendered as scout, 6th United States Cavalry. The name at the bottom, in a clerk's careful hand. Naltsis. Never delivered. Never filed where it needed filing. Just lost the way the Army lost most things that mattered and kept most things that didn't. Bragg sat there a long moment, holding 6 years of a man's whole life in one shaking hand. He thought about all the nights he'd spent since the wedding, turning this problem over without any real hope of solving it. Thought about how close he'd come to closing that trunk unopened. Thought briefly about what kind of world it was that could bury a man's entire legal existence inside a supply ledger and call it filing. Then he saddled his horse, rode out into the dark toward the ranch, because some news doesn't wait for morning. Naltsis was still awake when the knock came. Verity, too. Neither of them had been sleeping well, not with the hearing 2 days off, and Whitcomb's patience running thinner by the week. The way a man's patience always seems to thin once autumn starts pressing him toward a decision he'd rather make in his own time. He opened the door and Bragg didn't say a word, just held the paper out. Naltsis took it, read it. His hands, steady through fire and gunfire and 30 years of being told he wasn't fully real, were not steady. Now, it's real, Bragg said quietly. I checked the seal twice. Checked the clerk's name against records I still keep. It's real, Naltsis. Naltsis didn't answer, couldn't for a moment. Because a man can carry the weight of not existing officially for so long that he forgets what the opposite feels like. And here it was. Proof. Not a favor. Not a story somebody told on his behalf. His own name on paper saying plainly that he had always belonged exactly where he stood. He read it a third time, a fourth, as though the words might change if he stopped watching them closely enough. They didn't. They stayed exactly the same every time, which was, he was slowly starting to understand the entire point of a piece of paper like this one. It didn't need his belief to be true. It had simply always been true, sitting silent in a trunk for 6 years, waiting patiently for somebody to finally go looking. Thank you, he said finally. The words too small, he knew it. Said them anyway. Don't thank me, Bragg said, same as he'd said in the forge weeks before. Thank whoever it was that kept records back when nobody thought they'd matter. I just happened to be fool enough to hold on to trunks nobody told me to keep. Verity stood in the doorway, watching her husband's face in the lamplight, watching 30 years of being a rumor finally, quietly, come apart. She didn't say anything either. Some moments she was learning. Fenwick asked for silence, more than words, a lesson this man had taught her, without ever meaning to. From the very first evening he sat at her table and let his own silences speak for him. 2 days, Bragg said. Till the hearing. We'll want Bellamy there too if we can manage it. And whatever that matchbook can tell a room full of careful listeners, it'll tell them what it tells them, Naltsis said. Man can only lay the truth on a table. Can't make anybody pick it up. No, Bragg agreed. But you can make it awful hard for them to look away from it. The hearing was held in the town hall because Prairie Bend had no proper courthouse, and the town hall was where matters got settled when they were too large for a kitchen table and too small for a real judge. The room was fuller than Naltsis expected. Opal Finch, of course, seated near the front where she could see everything and repeat it accurately by supper. Dell from the store. A handful of ranchers who'd never spoken 2 words to him, but had apparently decided this was worth an afternoon's curiosity. Whitfield come all the way back from his next assignment because Naltsis had written asking him to testify to the survey, if it came to that. Whitcomb sat at the front, flanked by 2 men from the county, who mostly wanted the whole business finished before supper. Draycott sat near the back, arms crossed, watching with the stillness of a man who still believed, despite everything, that patience would eventually win him what force hadn't. Bellamy sat 2 rows in front of him, sweating though the room wasn't warm. Naltsis stood when his name was called. Felt every eye in the room land on him at once, the weight of being watched by people who'd already decided, most of them, which way they expected this to go before he'd said a single word. He laid the discharge paper on the table in front of Whitcomb. Found 3 days ago, he said, in Sergeant Bragg's own records, kept since we served together. Signed, sealed, never delivered. He kept his voice level, steady. I am not a man without a country, Agent Whitcomb. I am a man whose country lost his paperwork and never bothered telling him. Whitcomb examined it, turned it over. Something crossed his face that might, in a different man, have been embarrassment. This changes the reservation question, he admitted, slow. Careful. It does not address the fire. No, Naltsis agreed. It doesn't, so to address that, too. He set down a second item, wrapped carefully, the burned matchbook. Found at the site of the fire, he said. Tin convert, the kind given free at the bank counter. He looked deliberately at Bellamy. Perhaps Mr. Bellamy could tell the room how many of these he's given out this season, and to whom. Bellamy went white. He stammered. Rough counts, then Naltsis said. You told my friend Bragg you did. Whispers moved through the room, fast, the particular hushed murmur of a crowd smelling something worth remembering. Opal Finch leaned forward in her seat, notebook of memory already filling. Silence stretched. Whitcomb's eyes moved slow, from the matchbook to Bellamy to Draycott, reading the room the way Naltsis had once read a trail noting who wouldn't meet whose eyes and why. Mr. Bellamy, Whitcomb said. Answer the question. I don't have to answer anything, Bellamy said, though the words came out thin, unconvincing, the protest of a man who already knows he's cornered. You do, Whitcomb said. If you'd rather your own conduct not become part of this inquiry instead of merely a footnote to it. That landed. Bellamy's hands were shaking now. Draycott, he said finally, barely above a whisper. Draycott took a handful. Weeks back. Asked me not to mention it. The room went very quiet. Draycott stood up slow, his face a stone wall with nothing showing through it. "That proves nothing," he said. "A man can take matches and never strike one against another man's fence." "That's true," Naltzis said, "which is why I'm not asking you to answer for the fire today. I'm only asking Agent Whitcomb to notice that the thread he's been pulling on doesn't lead where he thought it did." A murmur of agreement moved through the room. Even Opal Finch, for once, said nothing, too busy watching to comment. Whitcomb sat with that a long moment, looked at the discharge paper again, looked at Draycott, looked finally at Naltzis. "The reservation matter is closed," he said. "Your status is confirmed, effective immediately." He paused. "The fire matter remains open. But I will say for the record, that open is not the same as decided. It wasn't a full victory." Naltzis understood that walking out of the hall, Verity's hand tight in his, the crowd parting around them with a mixture of curiosity and something that, in a few faces at least, looked almost like respect. But it was more ground than he'd had walking in, and a man learns, eventually, what to be grateful for ground, gained even when the whole field isn't won yet. Draycott left the hearing with something broken loose in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. 14 months of patience. Weeks of careful planning. And it had all come apart in a town hall over a handful of free matches he hadn't thought twice about taking. He rode home that evening past the burned church, its blackened cross still standing tilted, stubborn, same as it had been the day Naltzis first rode past it 4 months ago. He stopped his horse there without meaning to. He thought about his wife. 4 years gone. He thought about every acre he'd bought since, telling himself each one filled a little more of the hole she'd left. None of them had. Not one. He rode on toward his own house, where 2 men were waiting for him in the dark men he'd hired 3 days before the hearing, in case the hearing didn't go his way. Men paid to make sure that whatever the law decided, the land itself would end up settled a different way entirely, force being, in Draycott's private accounting, a more reliable tool than paperwork had proven to be. Tonight, he told them, before word of the hearing spreads any further, and the whole county starts watching that ranch too closely to touch it. Naltzis felt it before he heard it. Old instinct, the one that never fully slept, prickling awake sometime past midnight. He was up, dressed, at the window before Verity had even stirred. Riders. 3 of them. Coming up from the west, slow, deliberate, forward, the particular careful quiet of men who didn't want to be heard until they wanted to be heard. Verity, his voice was low, steady, wake up, now. She was up in seconds, the old fear of 14 months alone rising fast and familiar in her chest. "What is it, men?" he said. "Coming for the house." Her breath caught, because there it was, the fear she'd carried before he ever knocked on her door, the one she'd thought this marriage had finally put to rest. Except it hadn't put it to rest, it had just given the fear a different shape to wear. "How many? 3 that I can count. Might be more I can't. What do we do?" He was already pulling on his boots, moving with the same economy of motion she'd watched him bring to the fire, to the serve, to every crisis this land had thrown at them since the day he arrived. No wasted movement, no wasted words. He moved through the dark like the years scouting had built him to move silent, certain every step already 3 steps ahead of where his feet actually were. "Stay low," he told her. "Bar the door once I'm out. I'm going to meet them before they reach the porch." Naltzis, "Trust me," said. Just that. And she did, because she'd learned these past months that trust wasn't a leap with him. It was a plain, sturdy floor built one honest board at a time. Inside, Verity barred the door the way he'd told her, and then stood there in the dark kitchen with her back against the wood, heart pounding, straining to hear anything at all over the sound of her own breathing, because this was the part nobody warned a woman about, marrying into danger instead of away from it. Not the danger itself, she'd made her peace with that, mostly, these past months. It was the waiting, the not knowing. Standing in a dark kitchen while the person she loved most in the world walked out into the black to meet 3 armed strangers alone, and there was nothing at all she could do about it except stand very still and pray harder than she had ever prayed for anything in her life. She thought of Thomas, briefly. Unbidden, the fence line, the storm, the years of not knowing that had followed his death, wondering always whether there'd been anything she could have done differently, anything that might have kept him from riding out that particular morning. She would not lose this man the same way. She refused it, plain and simple, the refusal rising up in her chest hot and fierce, even as her hands shook against the doorframe. Lord, she prayed, not for the first time that year, and certainly not the last. I asked you for a husband. I did not ask for a widow's grief twice over in one lifetime. Send him back to me, whatever it cost. Send him back. Outside she heard voices low, sharp, unfamiliar, and then the particular flat command of her husband's voice, cutting through the dark. Ground. Now. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He had slipped out the back the moment the door was barred behind him. Circled wide through the dark, the way he'd circled 100 camps before, reading the rider's pace, their spacing, used the careless way two of them rode too close together, men who'd never done this kind of work before. Hired muscle without the patience for it. His mind ran fast and cold, the old scouting calm settling over him like a second skin. 3 riders. Unfamiliar forces. By the sound of their gait, nothing from Draycott's own stable, which meant hired hands, brought in from outside the county, men with no particular loyalty beyond whatever coin had bought their evening, which meant they could be turned or scattered. If a man moved fast enough and smart enough, and didn't let fear slow his hands the way fear slows most men's hands in the dark, he came up behind the nearest one before the man even knew the dark held anything but dark. What followed wasn't long, wasn't loud, not the way gunfights sound in stories told secondhand at a general store counter. It was quick, controlled. A man who knew exactly how much force a situation required and refused to spend 1 ounce more than that. The first rider went down before he understood what had taken his horse's reins from his hands, Naltz's hand closing over the bridle and pulling hard, the horse rearing, the man tumbling backward into the grass with a startled grunt. The second wheeled, drew, and found himself staring down the barrel of his own dropped rifle, retrieved and turned back on him faster than his mind could process the reversal. Ground, Naltz said, flat, final. Now. The man's hands went up, the rifle he'd been reaching for forgotten in the grass, his breath coming fast and ragged in the cold night air. We weren't told there'd be, he started. Weren't told be what? Naltz said. A man who knew how to fight back should have asked more questions before you took the coin. The third rider, watching from a distance, didn't wait to see how the arithmetic finished. He turned his horse and rode hard for the west line, abandoning the other 2 without a second thought, the sound of his retreat fading fast into the dark. Bragg arrived minutes later. Naltz had sent word to the forge the moment he'd first heard the riders, an old signal from their army days. A lantern hung a particular way at the gate, riding in fast enough that his horse was lathered white by the time he reined up. Looks like you didn't need me after all, Bragg said, taking in the scene. 2 men on the ground, hands raised, faces pale, with the fear of men who'd expected an easy night's work and gotten something else entirely. A third gone into the dark. Naltz standing over all of it, unhurt, breathing hard but steady. Wasn't sure of that until about 2 minutes ago, Naltz admitted. Man never is, Bragg said, swinging down to help secure the 2 captured riders. That's usually how you know you did it right. Verity came out onto the porch then, lantern in hand, and the light fell across her husband's face, soot from the fire weeks ago long since scrubbed away. But something else there now, something that looked almost like the man who'd knocked on her door 4 months earlier, except surer of himself, surer of his place, sure that the ground under his boots was finally, unquestionably, his to defend. She came down the steps slowly, still shaking, and he crossed to her without a word and took her in his arms, holding on a long moment, both of them breathing hard, both of them understanding without needing to say it that the fear had come very close tonight, closer than either of them wanted to examine too directly. It's over, he said quietly into her hair, for tonight. For all of it, I think, soon. I believed you, she said, when you said trust me. I wasn't even frightened, not the way I should have been. I just believed you. That's the finest thing anybody's ever told me, he said, and meant it more than any single sentence he'd spoken since the day he first took his hat off at her door. The 2 captured men talked before sunrise, the way men usually do once they understand exactly how much trouble they're actually in and how little loyalty a broken promise of payment is worth against jail time. Draycott hired us, one of them said, plain, no longer seeing much reason to protect a man who'd sent them into a fight he himself hadn't shown up for. Paid us half up front, promised the rest once the widow's husband was run off or worse, and the land settled quiet. before the hearing could even finish its business. By the time the sun cleared the east pasture, half the county knew it too. Naltsis sat on the porch step as the light came up, turning the whole night over in his mind the way he turned over. Everything slow, careful, looking for the parts that still didn't fit, because it should have frightened him more than it had. 3 riders in the dark hired to take his life or his land or both. And instead of fear, what he'd felt, moving through that darkness toward them, had been something closer to clarity. Certainty. What? The old scouting calm, the one he'd spent 30 years perfecting on other men's battlefields, finally turned toward defending something that was entirely, unmistakably his own, which struck him now, in the gray morning light, as its own kind of answer to a question he hadn't known he was still asking. Whether the years of training, the years of danger, the years of being useful to an army that never once thanked him properly, whether all of it had simply been preparation, all along, patient and unseen, for one particular dark night, on one particular stretch of Kansas ground. He didn't have proof of that. Wasn't the kind of thing a man could prove, the way Whitfield proved a boundary line with chains and numbers. But he believed it anyway, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, believing something without proof didn't feel like foolishness. It felt like faith. Draycott was waiting on his own porch when Naltsis and Bragg rode up that morning. Didn't run, didn't reach for a weapon, just sat there, in the growing light, looking like a man who had already, somewhere in the small hours of the night, run out of roads to walk down. "I suppose you've come for an accounting," he said. "I've come for the truth," Naltsis said, "whatever shape it takes." Draycott was quiet a long moment. His eyes moved past Naltsis, out toward his own range, toward acres he'd spent 4 years accumulating like a man stacking stones against a flood that had already, long ago, taken everything worth protecting. "You're not what I expected," Draycott said finally. "When you rode into this county, I'll admit that much." "What did you expect?" "Somebody easier to wait out," Draycott said. "Somebody who'd tire of the fight, or get himself hauled off by that federal agent, or simply prove me right about." He stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Both men understood exactly what word he'd swallowed rather than say out loud. "You were wrong," Naltsis said. Simple, not unkind. "Just true." "I was," Draycott admitted. Then he told it. All of it. The old survey, moved deliberate, years back, before Naltsis ever rode into this county. Bellamy's careful silence bought with a share of the disputed acreage that never once showed up on any legal document. The fire. The men hired to finish what the fire hadn't. 14 months of patience curdling, slow into something he barely recognized himself anymore. "My wife," he said finally, voice rough. 4 years gone. I told myself every acre I took filled the hole she left. It never did. Not one. I just kept telling myself it would. Next time, the next parcel, the next survey moved a few rods the right direction." He looked up at Naltsis. "I don't expect that to matter to a judge." "It doesn't excuse it," Naltsis said. "But I understand grief that doesn't know where to put itself. I've carried some of my own." Draycott studied him a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Surprise, maybe, that the man he'd tried to burn out of the county would offer him even that much understanding. "You could have let those men shoot me this morning," Draycott said. "Would have been simpler. Wouldn't have been right," Naltsis said. "There's a difference. Man who confuses simple with right usually ends up building the same kind of trouble you built, just a different shape of it." "What happens now?" "That's not mine to decide," Naltsis said, "but I'll tell the county what I know, plain, same as I told Whitcomb. And I expect what you told us just now, about the fire, about the men that'll matter more, coming from your own mouth, than anything I could have proven with a matchbook alone." Draycott nodded slowly. Something in his shoulders, some weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten its actual size, seemed to loosen, just slightly, in the confessing of it. "Tell your wife," he said. "I'm sorry. For all of it." "Tell her yourself," Naltsis said. "She's stronger than you're giving her credit for. Always has been. She'd rather hear it plain from you than filtered through me." Regret moved across Draycott's face. It's plain this time. And underneath it something that looked almost like leaf-foot, the relief of a man who finally has nothing left to hide. The formal matter closed within the week. Draycott's confession, corroborated by 2 hired men with nothing left to lose by telling the truth, settled what the matchbook alone couldn't have. Whitcomb, faced with a discharge paper that couldn't be argued with, and a fire confession that couldn't be denied, closed the file entirely, not with warmth, not with apology, because men like Whitcomb rarely learn to offer either. But closed, final, done. Your status is resolved, he told Naltsis the last time their paths crossed in Prairie Bend. Fully, I don't expect our paths to cross again. I don't expect I'll be sorry for that, Naltsis said. The faintest flicker of something crossed Whitcomb's face, not quite a smile, gone before it could fully form. No, he said. I don't expect you will be. He touched his hat, rode off, unhurried as always, out of Prairie Bend and, as far as either of them would ever know, out of their lives, entirely. One more piece of weather that had passed through, done its damage, and moved on towards some other county's trouble. The federal file was closed, but a file closing was one thing, and a life settling was another, and there was still a door 2,000 miles to the west that neither of them had opened yet. The letter came in late October, carried by a rider who'd traveled a long way to deliver it, forwarded through 3 different hands before it finally reached the ranch. Verity brought it in from the gate, turned it over, and went still at the return address. San Carlos. She carried it inside like it might break if she moved too fast. Set it on the table in front of Naltsis without a word. He stared at it a long moment before he touched it, because there was a whole life folded into that envelope. Every question he'd stopped letting himself ask, out of fear, the asking would hurt worse than the not knowing. Whether anyone was left. Whether anyone remembered him at all. Whether 6 years of silence had simply been 6 years of nobody bothering to wonder where he'd gone, or 6 years of a family too broken by distance and grief to know how to reach him even if they'd wanted to. He opened it with hands that, for the second time in a month, weren't quite steady. The letter was short, written in a careful, patient hand, the kind of handwriting that told him, before he'd even finished the first line, that whoever had written it had learned her letters the hard way, same as he had. His sister, Detet, alive, asking, plain and simple, whether the brother she'd heard rumors about a scout, married now, this, in Kansas, was truly him. He read it twice, then a third time. Verity sat across from him, watching, not asking, giving him the room to feel the whole size of it before either of them tried to put words to it. Because some things, she was learning, couldn't be rushed toward feeling. They had to be allowed to arrive in their own time, the way weather arrived, the way grief arrived, the way love, real love, the kind that survived fire and false surveys and federal agents, and a man's whole broken history had arrived in this very kitchen, slow and certain, over the course of one long, hard summer. She's alive, he said finally, voice rough. I know, Verity said softly. I have a sister still, after everything you do. He looked up at her, something enormous and unguarded in his face, the same face that had once told her plainly that he didn't know if a man like him was allowed to belong to anything at all. I want to go to her, he said, just to see her. Make sure she's safe. Let her see with her own eyes that I'm not a rumor anymore either. Then go, Verity said, without a moment's hesitation. You've earned the right to that more than any man I've ever known. I'll come back, he said. I want you to hear me say that plain so there's no confusing it. This is home now. You're home now. I'm not choosing between you and her. I'm choosing both, if the world will let me hold on to both at once. It will, Verity said. Because I'll be here, and because come spring, when the roads are easier and the work slower, I'd like to go with you. If she'll have me. I'd like to meet the woman who helped raise the man who knocked on my door. Something worked behind his eyes for a moment, unreadable. You'd do that, he said. Ride all that way. Meet a family you've never known, in a place that still's, by every account, harder living than this ranch has ever been. I married a man, Naltsis, she said, not half of one. Whatever parts of you exist out past this county's edge, your sister, your language, she's the songs you still sing sometimes without meaning to. Those are mine to know too, if you'll let me. I don't want the version of you that fits neatly into Kansas. I want all of you, even the parts that ache. Something broke open in his chest, warm and sudden the relief, almost dizzying, of discovering that the choice he'd feared, old life or new one, blood or vow, had never actually needed to be a choice at all. He reached across the table, took her hand, the same way he had that first morning, in this same kitchen, when she'd told him yes, and he hadn't yet understood the full size of what he was agreeing to. Spring then, he said. Spring, she agreed. Winter came early that year, the first hard frost silvering the grass on the land they'd fought all summer to keep. The note at the bank was paid in full by November, the fire's damage repaired, the fence rebuilt straighter and truer than it had ever stood before, the corner stake replaced with a new one, set by Whitfield's own hands, that no man would ever again be able to quietly move in the dark. In town, even Opal Finch had, grudgingly, begun to shift her account of things. Well, she told Dell one afternoon, over a bolt of green wool she had, this time, actual intention of buying. I did say it was either an answered prayer or a coming disaster. Suppose I ought to admit which one it turned out to be. Suppose you ought, Dell said, and, for once, she let him have the last word. On a clear afternoon near the end of November, Naltsis stood at the corrected corner, driving the last post of a fence line that had cost them nearly everything to hold on to. 3 clean strikes. He stopped for a moment on the last one, listening to the sound of the hammer come back off the fence wire, off the frozen ground, off a horizon that belonged now, unquestionably, to him. It sounded different than it had 4 months ago. He still couldn't have told you exactly how. It just did, he thought, standing there about everything the sound was carrying now that it hadn't carried before. 30 years of borrowed barns and other men's fences, a ravine near Fort Hayes, and a young corporal he still couldn't picture clearly, whose life had somehow, impossibly, folded itself into his own without either of them ever knowing it at the time. A burned church, a rider on a ridge who turned out to be exactly the danger his instincts had warned him he was. A discharge paper, lost for 6 years, waiting patiently in a trunk for a blacksmith stubborn enough to keep looking. A sister, alive, 2,000 miles away, holding a door open for him same as Verity had held hers. All of it, somehow, folded into the sound of one hammer against one post on one particular stretch of Kansas ground that was, at long last, entirely his to defend. Verity came out to find him there, wrapped as against the cold, her Bible tucked under one arm out of habit more than need, because some things a person keeps close, simply for the comfort of their weight. Come inside, she said. Supper's near ready in a minute, he said. Wanted to finish this post first. She stood beside him a moment, looking out over land that had tried, in a dozen different ways that year, to be taken from them by a bank, by a lie 40 rods wide by fire, by a federal agent's careless letter, by hired men in the dark, and had, every single time, refused to be. A cord of 3 strands, she said quietly, remembering the Reverend's words from a wedding that felt, now, like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. You, me, and the one who's been braiding us together the whole time, whether we could see it happening or not. 4 strands, maybe, Naltsis said, counting your husband. He started this without either of us knowing it. Seems only right he gets counted in the sum of it. She looked at him, surprised, moved, in the particular quiet way she'd learned was his truest tell. You've been thinking about that. Every day, he admitted. A man doesn't get handed a debt like that and just set it down again. I carry it. Gladly. He'd have liked you, she said. I think about that sometimes, whether the two of you would have gotten on, if things had gone differently. Might have, Naltsis said. Or might have just passed each other on some road once. 2 strangers, never knowing what already stood between us. Some things, I think, only make themselves known once a person's ready to see them. Are you ready now, she asked, to see all of it? Everything that's brought you here. He considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things she asked him. I'm getting there, he said. Every day, a little more of it comes clear. Might take the rest of my life to see the whole shape of it. I don't mind that. Long as I've got the years to keep looking. You'll have them, she said. I intend to see to that personally. He almost laughed at that, the plain, steady confidence of it, so entirely her, so entirely the woman who had once told a stranger, without blinking, that she'd been praying for him for 2 months. They stood there together as the light went gold and low over the cottonwoods, over the creek that ran cold and clear and entirely legally theirs, over a home that had started, 4 months before, as nothing more than a business arrangement between 2 strangers desperate enough to ask God for exactly what they needed, and had become, by every measure either of them had ever used to weigh a life, exactly right. Naltsis Stone, who had prayed in the backs of freight wagons, and never once for a home, drove the final nail into a fence post on land that was, by law and by vow and by a debt 6 years old, finally come full circle, entirely his, and he stopped to listen to the sound come back. It sounded like home, a cord of 3 strands. Or 4 if a person counted honestly, the way Naltsis had learned to count most things now, slow, careful, giving weight to every thread that had brought him here, whether he'd been able to see it at the time or not. Somewhere behind him, smoke rose steady from the chimney of a white house with a green door, the same door he'd knocked on 4 months before, with his hat in his hands and nothing else to his name but a rumor and a hope. He turned finally and walked toward it, not because anyone told him to, because it was his to walk toward now. And a man who has spent 30 years learning what it costs to belong, nowhere does not, once he finally finds the one door that opens for him and stays open, ever again walk toward it slowly.